By the time I gave up on Ethan Whitman, my love for him no longer felt private. It had witnesses. My roommate saw it in the trays of matcha cookies cooling on our kitchen counter after I heard him say, once, that he missed green tea. The baristas near campus saw it every time I walked in and ordered the same 2 drinks, an iced vanilla oat latte for me, and a black cold brew with 1 pump of hazelnut for him. People in our lecture halls saw it when I saved him a seat before he asked, when I copied notes he had missed, when I looked toward the door before class because some foolish part of me always knew the shape of him before he arrived. For 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, I loved Ethan with the kind of faith that embarrassed everyone except me. Even he knew. Of course he knew. Ethan was many things, but cruel was not one of them. That almost made it worse. If he had been careless, selfish, or mean, I could have hated him and saved myself years of hoping. But Ethan Whitman did not play games. He did not lead me on. He did not offer warmth and then pretend not to notice when I mistook it for something more. He was simply honest. An engineering major to the bone, he saw the world in measurements, pressure points, load-bearing walls, and clean lines drawn with a steady hand. If a bridge could not hold, he would not pretend it could. If a design had no foundation, he would not build on it because someone begged prettily enough. And if he did not love me, he would not call it love just to spare me. Once, outside Bob's library, he told me the truth so gently I almost missed how badly it hurt. The wind had been sharp that day, whipping my dark hair across my mouth and eyes. Leaves skittered over the concrete steps and gathered near our shoes. I remember everything too clearly, the gray sky, his green eyes, the warmth of my cardigan pulled tight across my chest because my hands had started to shake. "Claire," he said, quiet but steady, "I care about you." "I do. But not in the way you want me to." I smiled because I did not know what else to do. His face did not change. "You should not wait for me." There it was. The clean cut. I laughed like he had said something absurd. "I'm not waiting," I told him. My voice sounded bright and fake, even to me. "We just keep ending up in the same place." He looked at me for a long second. I looked away first. After that, I should have stopped. I should have taken my bruised little heart home, put away the hope, and learned how to want a life that did not have Ethan in the middle of it. Instead, I mistook endurance for romance. I thought loving someone long enough might become proof. I thought devotion could stack itself into evidence until he had no choice but to see me. I believed, with the stubborn stupidity of a girl who had read too many love stories, that if I stayed close, if I cared harder, if I became useful and familiar and impossible to lose, one morning he would wake up and understand. He would look at me and realize I had been there all along. I had been the answer. That was the worst lie I ever told myself. Ethan did not fall in love with me because I brought him coffee. He did not change his mind because I remembered the small things. My loyalty did not become beautiful to him. It became ordinary. I turned into part of the background of his life. A familiar sound under everything else. Like the subway running beneath the streets. Always there. Easy to tune out. Until the day I finally stopped moving toward him. The scent of espresso and toasted sourdough filled the crowded interior of the Daily Grind, a cramped coffee shop nestled just off Mercer Street. Rain streaked the wide glass windows, blurring the yellow taxis crawling down the wet asphalt outside. I leaned against the wooden counter, shifting my weight from one foot to the other while I waited for our order. I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the pastry display case, a round face framed by shoulder-length dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends, warm brown eyes dusted with a light layer of gold shimmer, and a bright berry lipstick that took me 20 minutes to apply. My olive trench coat didn't quite hide the curve of my hips, but I had paired it with a black turtleneck that made me feel put together, confident, and sharp. "One iced oat milk latte, and one black cold brew, hazelnut," the barista called out, sliding the 2 cups across the counter. "Thank you, Ryan." I smiled, picking up both cups. I pulled a small blue post-it note from my coat pocket and stuck it onto the plastic lid of the cold brew. On it, I had drawn a tiny, terribly rendered blueprint of a bridge with the words, "Good luck on the structural analysis exam. Don't collapse." I pushed through the glass door into the cool, damp September air, balancing the drinks carefully as I navigated the crowded sidewalk toward the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with my index finger while holding the coffee tray with my elbow. "Fiona, Tell me you did not wake up at 7 a.m. to buy him coffee again. Fiona, Claire Morgan. Answer me right now. I chuckled, typing back a quick one-handed reply as I cut through the arch at Washington Square Park. Claire, it's on my way to my 9 a.m. marketing strategy class. Technically. Fiona, it's 6 blocks in the wrong direction. You are sick. A victim. I am calling an intervention. I smiled at my phone, locking the screen as I reached the heavy brass doors of Brown Building. Fiona meant well, but she didn't understand. She saw it as desperation, I saw it as investment. Love wasn't just a feeling, it was an action. I took the stairs to the 3rd floor, my heart doing its familiar, ridiculous flutter as I approached the study lounge outside the engineering labs. He was sitting at the high wooden table by the window. Ethan Whitman looked like he had been pulled straight out of a minimalist architecture magazine. Broad shoulders beneath a simple dark gray sweater, crisp dark hair slightly messy from running his hands through it, and those sharp, striking green eyes focused entirely on the laptop screen in front of him. A silver mechanical pencil was balanced neatly between his fingers, clicking rhythmically against his sketchbook. Beside him sat Lucas, his roommate, who was currently slouched in a chair, loudly eating a bagel. If you eat any louder, Lucas, I'm going to throw your laptop out the window, Ethan said softly, his voice a low, grounded baritone that sent a familiar shiver down my spine. He didn't even look up from his screen. Hey, a man needs brain fuel for structural dynamics, Lucas protested, crumbs flying. Oh, thank God. Savior arriving at 12 o'clock. Ethan glanced up at the sound of Lucas's voice, his gaze landing on me as I walked into the lounge. Morning, boys, I said brightly, setting the cold brew down next to Ethan's neat pile of grid paper. I slipped into the empty chair across from him, setting my own latte down with a quiet thump. Brought sustenance for the starving engineers. Lucas gasped in dramatic relief. Claire, I swear if Ethan doesn't marry you, I will. You're not my type, Lucas. You don't take your coffee black, I teased, keeping my eyes fixed on Ethan. Ethan paused, his pencil suspended over his paper. He looked at the cup, then at the blue sticky note with my silly drawing. A subtle, almost imperceptible line formed between his brows. He didn't smile. He didn't look pleased. Claire, Ethan said quietly, setting his pencil down with a deliberate, soft tap. You didn't need to do this. It was no trouble, I said easily, resting my chin in my hand and smiling up at him. I was already at the daily grind. Plus, you looked like you were going to pull an all-nighter when I bumped into you yesterday. I told you yesterday that I was fine, Ethan replied. His tone was even, entirely devoid of malice, but flat. And your class is in the Silver Center. This isn't on your way. The silence that stretched between us felt heavy for a second, but I pushed through it, refusing to let the warmth in my chest dim. It's only 5 minutes out. Besides, consider it an investment. When you're designing the next Brooklyn Bridge, I'll claim 5% commission in free coffee. Lucas snorted into his napkin, but Ethan didn't laugh. He slowly peeled the post-it note off the cup, folded it once, and placed it neatly beside his laptop without looking at the drawing. Thanks for the coffee, Claire, he said, taking a small sip before pulling his laptop closer. But don't do it again. You're wasting your money. The words were plain, practical, and meant to set a boundary. They weren't meant to be mean, which somehow made them sting even more. If he had been rude, I could have been angry. But Ethan was just sensible. Noted, boss, I said softly, standing up and slinging my leather tote bag over my shoulder. I smoothed down my trench coat, maintaining my bright smile. Good luck on the test today. Both of you. Thanks, Claire. You're a gem. Lucas called out. Ethan looked up once as I turned to leave. See you later, Claire. See you, I replied. As I walked down the echoing hallway toward the elevator, the bright smile slid off my face, replaced by a quiet, lingering ache in the center of my chest. I looked at my hands empty now. I took a deep breath, shaking my head as the elevator doors slid open. It's fine, I told myself, stepping inside and pressing the button for the lobby. He's just stressed about his exam. He'll see it eventually. I just had to keep showing up. The Silver Center lecture hall smelled like damp wool, stale filter coffee, and the collective existential dread of 80 marketing majors struggling through advanced consumer behavior. He folded the note? Fiona lowered her giant iced match and oat latte, her dark eyebrows drawn into an aggressive, sharp V. Her gold hoop earrings caught the harsh fluorescent lighting as she swung around in her seat to face me. Didn't he laugh? Didn't he even chuckle at the little bridge? Didn't he chuck it in the trash either, I pointed out, tapping my blue ballpoint pen against my tablet screen. He folded it neatly. That's organized. Respectful. That is clinical, Claire, Vivian said calmly, not taking her eyes off her laptop, where her fingers flew across the keyboard at 90 words per minute. That is the behavior of a man receiving a utility bill. He acknowledges receipt, he files it away, and he hopes he doesn't get another one next month. Ouch, Sophie muttered from my left, looking up from her pastel-highlighted textbook with a sympathetic grimace. Vivian, tone it down. She's fragile. I am not fragile, I insisted, pulling my shoulders back and straightening the collar of my olive trench coat, which I had draped over the back of my seat. I am persistent. There is a massive strategic difference between being deluded and being committed. In marketing, we call it brand immersion. The consumer doesn't know they need the product until it becomes an indispensable part of their daily environment. Vivian stopped typing. She slowly turned her head, resting her chin on her hand, looking at me over the rim of her blue light glasses. Ethan Whitman is an engineering major, Claire. He doesn't want brand immersion. He wants structural integrity. And right now, your romantic campaign has the structural integrity of wet paper towels. Fiona cackled, quickly slapping a hand over her mouth as Professor Whitman, no relation, thank God, cleared his throat near the podium at the front of the hall. Look, I whispered, leaning in closer to the three of them as the slide deck flickered onto the projector. It's slow progress, okay? He was stressed about his structural analysis midterm. Guys are compartmentalizers. He couldn't process a romantic gesture while thinking about cantilever beans. He hasn't processed a romantic gesture in 3 years, Fiona pointed out, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial hiss. Freshman year, you brought him homemade cinnamon rolls when he had the flu. Sophomore year, you stayed up until 3 a.m. helping him paint that scale model for his urban design class. Which he got an A on, by the way, I interjected proudly. And junior year, Fiona continued smoothly, ignoring my interruption, you bought him a vintage 1980s drafting compass off eBay for his birthday, and do you know what he gave you for yours? I bit the inside of my cheek. A gift card. A $25 Starbucks gift card, Fiona repeated, holding up 2 fingers for emphasis. Printed on a piece of paper. He didn't even buy the plastic one. He emailed it to you, Claire. He was busy. He has a stone wall, Vivian chimed in softly, her eyes flicking back to her notes. And you're bruising your knuckles trying to punch a door into him. I looked down at my lap, my thumbs tracing the smooth edge of my phone screen. They weren't wrong. I wasn't stupid. I had a 3.8 GPA, I had secured a competitive summer internship at a boutique brand agency in Soho, and I could read people's motivations better than almost anyone in our major. I knew how Ethan looked at me. I knew the exact shade of calm, polite indifference that washed over his face whenever I pushed too hard. I knew he didn't love me. But the terrifying truth was that I didn't know how to stop. Loving Ethan Whitman had become a habit, a subconscious rhythm like breathing. If I stopped walking 6 blocks out of my way to buy his coffee, if I stopped saving him a seat at the dining hall, if I stopped looking for his dark hair and broad shoulders in every crowd on Washington Square, who was I supposed to be? I was Claire Morgan. The girl who loved Ethan Whitman. It was an identity I had built brick by brick until it felt like the only house I knew how to live in. By 4 p.m., the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed in a cold, gray autumn sheen. Steam rose from the subway grates along West 4th Street, smelling of wet concrete and roasted nuts from the vendor cart on the corner. I met the group at Kimmel Center, up on the 10th floor where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the downtown skyline. Our group of friends had long ago merged into a sprawling, chaotic ecosystem. Between my girls and Ethan's engineering crew, we took up an entire long study table in the lounge. Books, blueprints, laptops, and half-empty boba cups were scattered across the laminate surface. Lucas was currently lying flat on his back on the carpeted floor, staring at the ceiling tiles. If I fail this exam, I'm moving to Alaska to become a salmon fisher. I've decided. No math in salmon fishing. There's a lot of logistics in commercial fishing, actually, Derek said without looking up from his tablet, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses. Supply chain, weight distribution, fuel efficiency. Derek, shut up, Lucas groaned, covering his face with a notebook. Let me dream. Tyler sat across from Derek, quietly reviewing a set of schematics, while Gavin was busy attempting to balance 3 dry erase markers on his upper lip. Ethan was at the far end of the table. He had his gray sweater sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing strong, pale forearms crossed over a heavy textbook. His hair was slightly messier than it had been this morning, a dark tuft sticking up near the crown where he clearly pulled at it in frustration. Beside him sat Olivia. Olivia Clark was the kind of girl who looked like she had been born under a lucky star. She was an art history major with effortless, honey blonde hair that always seemed to catch whatever sunlight was left in the room, pale skin, and a soft, melodic laugh that made people turn around in coffee shops just to see who it belonged to. She was wearing an oversized cream cable knit sweater that slipped slightly off one shoulder, and she was currently leaning over Ethan's blueprint, pointing at something with a red pen. See? Olivia said, her voice bright and light. If you adjust the angle of the arch here, it doesn't just hold more weight, it looks less like a brutalist parking garage. Ethan didn't pull away. In fact, he leaned in closer to her, his sharp green eyes softening as he looked down at where her pen was resting. A faint, real smile tugged at the corner of his lips, a smile I had spent 3 years trying to buy with coffees, notes, and devotion. It's a load-bearing bridge, Olivia, Ethan said, and his voice had a completely different texture now. It wasn't the flat, polite baritone he used with me. It was warm. It was relaxed. It's supposed to hold trucks, not look pretty in a gallery. Why can't it do both? Olivia bumped her shoulder playfully against his. You engineers have no soul. We have logic, Ethan replied, but he didn't move his shoulder away. He let it rest against hers for 3 agonizing seconds before she leaned back to take a sip of her iced tea. My heart didn't break in that moment. It was worse than that, it felt like a cold, heavy stone sinking straight down into the pit of my stomach. I sat down next to Fiona, quietly sliding my laptop out of my tote bag. Hey, Claire, Gavin said, dropping his dry erase markers as he sat up. Did you finish the slide deck for our group marketing presentation? Yeah, I said, forcing my voice to sound light, cheerful, and entirely unaffected. I pulled up the file on my screen. I added the consumer demographic charts. Take a look. Across the table, Ethan's head snapped up at the sound of my voice. His green eyes met mine. For a second, the warmth that had been on his face for Olivia vanished, replaced by that familiar, guarded composure. He glanced at my laptop, then at the half-empty cup of cold brew sitting on the table near his elbow, the one I had brought him this morning. He had drunk half of it. Claire, Ethan acknowledged, giving me a short, polite nod. Ethan, I replied, matching his nod perfectly. I smiled, bright, polished, and empty. How was the exam? It was fine, he said simply. He crushed it, Lucas yelled from the floor. The man is a machine. He doesn't bleed, he just secretes formulas. Olivia laughed, reaching over to lightly pat Ethan's arm. Told you were worrying for nothing. Ethan looked down at Olivia's hand on his arm, his expression softening again, before he looked back at his screen. He didn't say anything else to me. He didn't mention the cold brew. He didn't mention the drawing. I looked down at my keyboard, my fingers resting on the keys. Beside me, Fiona reached out under the table and squeezed my knee hard. She didn't say a word, but her grip was tight, steady, and full of quiet fury on my behalf. I swallowed past the lump in my throat, opening my marketing deck, and started to type. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself Olivia was just his childhood friend, that they had known each other since they were 7 years old, that off-shoulder sweaters and playful shoulder bumps were just how they were. I told myself 100 lies a day back then. And the scariest part was how much I still wanted to believe them. The rain returned by 8 o'clock, turning the cobblestone streets of Greenwich Village into slick, dark mirrors reflecting the neon signage of West 4th Street. Our group had migrated from Kimmel Center to Joe's Pizza, packing into 2 adjoining wooden booths near the back corner where the heat from the industrial ovens kept the window glass perpetually fogged. The air was thick with the rich, savory tang of garlic, crushed oregano, and melting mozzarella. Lucas was in the middle of a theatrical reenactment of his professor's mid-lecture breakdown, using 2 garlic knots as props to represent structural stress vectors. And then Dr. Hale looks at me dead in the eye, mind you, and says, "Mr. Bennett, if you build a retaining wall like this in the real world, you won't just fail my class, you'll be indicted by a grand jury." Lucas slammed a garlic knot onto his paper plate. "An indictment, Claire?" "For an off by 1 decimal point." The entire table burst into laughter. Even Vivian smiled over the rim of her sparkling water, while Sophie shook her head, fondly exasperated. I laughed along, resting my chin on my palm as I sat on the outer edge of our booth. "Look on the bright side, Lucas. Prison orange is definitely your color." "Don't encourage him," Ethan said from the opposite booth. He was sitting next to Olivia, his long legs stretched out under the narrow table. Because space was tight, his dark jeans brushed against the side of my knee every time he shifted. Every single contact sent a tiny, electric spark tracing up my skin, though I did my absolute best to act like I couldn't feel it. Ethan pulled a slice of pepperoni pizza from the cardboard box in the center, carefully blotting the excess oil off the cheese with a paper napkin before setting it on a plate in front of Olivia. "Here," Ethan said softly to her. "No crust, just like you like." Olivia offered him a sweet, easy smile, casually tucking a strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear. "You're the best, Ethan. Truly." It was an action so automatic, so deeply ingrained in their routine, that no one else at the table even batted an eye. Derek was busy debating Gavin on the merits of parametric design, Fiona was arguing with Tyler about music, and Lucas was eyeing the last slice of sausage. Only I saw it. Only I felt the precise, surgical twist in my gut. It wasn't just that Ethan remembered how Olivia liked her pizza. It was the absolute, unthinking ease of it. He didn't have to analyze her preferences or file them away like data points. He just knew her. He anticipated her without being asked, without a single post-it note or grand gesture required. For 3 years, I had been trying to learn Ethan Whitman like a second language, translating his quiet stoicism into signs of hope. But sitting across from him now, watching him hand a paper napkin to Olivia before she even realized her fingers were greasy, I saw the truth plain as day. Ethan didn't speak my language. He spoke hers. "Claire," Fiona's voice broke through my spiral, her sharp eyes cutting toward me from across the booth. She nudged my forearm under the table. "Did you show Ethan the draft for the Brooklyn Arts Festival campaign?" I blinked, forcing my focal length away from Ethan's hands. "Oh. No, it's just a rough draft. We don't submit the final deck until next Friday." "Show him," Lucas chimed in, wiping his hands. "Claire's a visual genius, Ethan. She redesigned our club's logo last semester and literally doubled our event attendance." Ethan turned his head, those piercing green eyes fixing onto mine. The noise of the busy pizzeria seemed to mute slightly, the surrounding chatter dropping into the background. "What's the concept?" Ethan asked. His tone was curious, grounded, completely polite. I swallowed, pulling my tablet out of my leather tote bag and tapping the screen awake. It's an integrated promotional campaign for local independent artists in Dumbo. The theme is Unseen Foundations. It's about highlighting the structural elements of art that people usually overlook: the raw materials, the scaffolding, the labor. I slid the tablet across the laminate table, stopping it right in front of his hands. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wood, his eyes scanning the digital layout I had spent 4 late nights perfecting. My heart hammered against my ribs, a pathetic, hopeful beat. I had specifically incorporated geometric lines and industrial bridge motifs into the graphic design because I thought of him when I made it. Every line was a silent love letter written in typography and grid alignment. Ethan looked at it for a long, quiet 10 seconds. The silence between us stretched, heavy and expectant. "The color palette is good," Ethan finally said, his voice measured. He tapped a corner of the screen. "The typography is clean. But if you're using real structural motifs for the scaffolding graphics, these cross-bracings here are load-bearing impossibilities. If this were a real structure, the cantilevered frame would collapse under its own weight." My smile froze. Across from him, Olivia leaned over to look at the screen, letting out a small, musical laugh. "Ethan, it's a graphic design poster for an art festival, not a structural blueprint for the Department of Transportation. Nobody is checking the physics of the vector art." "I know," Ethan replied, glancing at Olivia with a slight, softening expression. "I'm just saying. If you're going for authenticity, the angle should make sense." He looked back at me, sliding the tablet back across the table. It looks nice, Claire. Good work. It looks nice. 3 words. Polite. Encouraging. Completely detached. He didn't see the hours of thought. He didn't see the subtle nod to his world woven into mine. He just saw an inaccurate vector graphic that wouldn't hold weight. Thanks, I whispered, pulling the tablet back into my lap and closing the cover. I'll fix the angles. Don't change a thing, Claire, it's gorgeous, Fiona snapped, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made Lucas pause mid-bite. Fiona glared directly at Ethan, her dark eyes flashing with unfiltered irritation. Not everything in the world needs to be calculated down to the millimeter, Whitman. Ethan blinked, visibly caught off guard by the hostility in her voice. He straightened his back, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. I didn't say it wasn't good. I was just giving feedback. Unsolicited feedback, Fiona muttered under her breath, turning back to her drink. Hey, Olivia said gently, placing a soft, calming hand on Ethan's forearm. Her blue-green eyes looked at him with total understanding. It's okay. You're just an engineer. You can't help it. Ethan looked down at Olivia's hand on his arm, the slight tension in his shoulders instantly melting away. He let out a quiet exhale, nodding slowly. Yeah. Guess so. I sat there, watching the two of them. I looked at the way Ethan's eyes lingered on Olivia's face, the soft, unspoken longing that he couldn't quite hide, no matter how reserved he tried to be. I looked at the way he softened whenever she touched him, a stark, painful contrast to the polite, rigid distance he maintained whenever I got too close. He wasn't incapable of love. He wasn't emotionally broken or too robotic to feel. He just didn't feel it for me. I reached for my glass of iced water, my hand trembling slightly as I brought it to my lips. The cold glass stung my fingertips, a grounding sensation against the quiet, hollow ache blossoming in my chest. She fell first, the universe seemed to whisper in the crowded, noisy room. And as I watched Ethan Whitman gently smile at a girl who would never love him back, I realized the cruelest part of it all. We were both standing in the rain, holding umbrellas over people who were looking at someone else. Friday night came in with a crisp, biting cold that smelled of roasted chestnuts, hot pavement, and the damp salt air sweeping off the Hudson. The 3-story brownstone off-street Mark's Place was bursting at the seams. It was the annual Civil Engineering Society mixer, which had inevitably devolved into a chaotic, loud college party with red solo cups, thumping bass vibrating through the floorboards, and 50 drunk students trying to explain fluid dynamics over hip-hop tracks. Drink this, Fiona commanded, handing me a plastic cup filled with something sparkling, pink, and dangerously sweet. She looked radiant in a burgundy velvet top, her tight dark curls framed by big gold hoops. You've been staring at the front door for 45 minutes, Claire. I am prescribing fun. I am having fun, I lied, taking a small sip of the punch. I was leaning against the kitchen island, smoothing down the front of my dark green wrap dress. I had spent an hour curling my shoulder-length dark brown hair so it fell in soft, loose waves around my collarbones, and I de-painted my nails a deep cranberry red. You're tracking him like a missile, Vivian said, leaning beside me while checking her phone. And for the record, he doesn't deserve the hair or the dress. I dressed up for me, I countered, though my eyes involuntarily flicked toward the narrow entryway again. Right, Sophie murmured, offering me a sympathetic smile over her ginger ale. Which is why you've checked the hallway mirror 3 times in 30 minutes. I bit my lip, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. Okay, fine. But he said he was coming. Lucas confirmed it. Right on cue, the front door burst open, letting in a draft of chilly night air alongside a wave of loud laughter. Lucas walked in first, wearing an atrocious floral Hawaiian shirt over a hoodie, followed closely by Derek, Tyler, and Gavin. And behind them came Ethan. My breath caught in my throat. Ethan Whitman didn't do party attire. He wore a fitted black crewneck sweater, dark jeans, and his usual worn leather jacket, but the simplicity of it made him look infuriatingly handsome. His dark hair was slightly windblown from the walk, and as he stepped into the warm apartment, he raised a hand to push it back from his forehead, his green eyes scanning the crowded room. And then he saw me. For a second, just a fraction of a second, his eyes locked onto mine. His gaze dipped down to my dress, then back up to my face, taking in the loose curls and the berry-stained lips. Something shifted in his expression, a subtle tightening of his jaw, before his face smoothed back into its default, calm composure. My heart pounded against my ribs. I gave him a small, bright wave. Ethan offered a short, polite nod in return, but before he could step toward the kitchen, the door opened one more time. Olivia stepped inside. She was shivering slightly, her cheeks flushed rosy from the chill, wearing an oversized beige trench coat over a cream silk slip dress. She looked like a vintage movie star who had casually stumbled into a Brooklyn house party. Ugh, it's freezing out there. Olivia laughed, shaking out her blonde hair. Ethan turned instantly. Without a second thought, he stepped closer to her, holding out his hand. Give me your coat. I'll go hang it up in the bedroom. Thanks, Ethan. You're a lifesaver, Olivia said, unbuttoning the coat and sliding it off her shoulders into his hands. I stood by the kitchen island, my plastic cup frozen halfway to my lips. Claire, Fiona whispered softly beside me, her voice dropping the sarcastic edge it usually carried. Don't. I'm fine, I murmured, taking a long drink of the sweet alcohol. It's fine. An hour later, the party was in full swing. Lucas was attempting to teach Gavin how to do a line dance in the middle of the crowded living room, and Vivian and Sophie had wandered off to talk to some upperclassmen from the Stern Business School. I found Ethan standing on the small, fire escape balcony attached to the back kitchen. The cool September air was a welcome relief against my warm skin. The ambient noise of the party felt muffled behind the heavy glass door, replaced by the faint, rhythmic rumble of the city below. Ethan was leaning against the wrought iron railing, holding a half-empty bottle of beer, looking out over the dark back alleyways of the East Village. I pushed the glass door open, stepping out onto the cold metal platform. Hey, I said gently. Ethan turned his head, his green eyes reflecting the faint yellow glow of the street lamps below. Claire. It's cold out here. You should be inside. I needed some air, I replied, leaning against the railing next to him, keeping a few inches of polite distance between us. You looked like you needed some air, too. Ethan took a slow sip of his beer, looking back out at the city skyline. It's loud in there. It's an engineering party. Loud is practically required, I joked, smiling up at him. You looked great tonight, by the way. Very, tailored. Ethan didn't he smile. He turned his body slightly, setting his beer bottle on the wide flat rail behind him. He looked down at me, his eyes heavy, steady, and unreadable. Claire, he said quietly. The tone of his voice made my chest tighten instantly. It wasn't his casual, indifferent voice. It was the voice he used when he was about to deliver bad news about a structural calculation. Yeah? I kept my smile locked in place, desperately trying to shield myself with brightness. Why are you here? He asked. At the party? Because Lucas invited us. No, Ethan interrupted softly, his green eyes cutting straight through my facade. Why are you out here? Why did you bring me coffee on Tuesday? Why did you buy those specific pastries last week? Why are you wearing that dress? My hands tightened on the iron railing. The cold metal bit into my palms, but I couldn't feel it over the sudden, violent racing of my blood. Ethan. I need you to listen to me, Claire, Ethan said. His voice was completely calm, completely flat, and completely devoid of cruelty, which made it 1,000 times worse. I'm not going to pretend I don't see what you're doing. I see it. I've seen it for 3 years. The air left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. The humiliation hit me instantly, hot and sickening, burning behind my eyes. I told you freshman year, Ethan continued, his tone entirely practical, as if he were explaining a mathematical truth that could not be negotiated. I like you as a friend. You're smart, you're funny, and you're good to everyone around you. But I do not feel that way about you. I am never going to feel that way about you. Ethan, please. No, Claire. Stop, he said, stepping a fraction closer, forcing me to look at him. You keep doing these things. You keep waiting for me, buying me things, showing up where I am. You think if you just stay around long enough, something is going to change. It's not. I just wanted to take care of you, I whispered, my voice breaking slightly despite my best efforts. The bright, confident persona I had built melted away, leaving me feeling tiny, exposed, and horribly pathetic in my nice green dress. I thought if you saw how much I cared. I don't need you to take care of me, Ethan said plainly. And I don't want you wasting your time. It makes me uncomfortable, Claire. It makes me feel like I owe you something I can't give you. It makes me uncomfortable. The words hit my chest like a physical blow. For 3 years, I thought I was being devoted. I thought I was being a constant, bright light in his life. I thought I was showing him what love looked like. I had just been a burden. An awkward, persistent inconvenience that he felt obligated to manage. I see, I whispered. My vision blurred slightly, but I forced the tears back, swallowing down the thick, choking knot in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut for a brief second, breathing in the cold air, before opening them again. Ethan stood there, looking down at me. He didn't look angry. He didn't look guilty. He just looked resolved, waiting for me to acknowledge the boundary he had drawn. Okay, I said. My voice was surprisingly steady now, stripped of all its warmth, leveled out into a flat line. Okay, Ethan. I'm sorry if that was harsh, Ethan added, resting his hand briefly on his back pocket. But I needed to be clear. I don't want to hurt you, but you need to move on. You were clear, I said quietly. I pulled my arms tight across my chest, wrapping my coat around myself as the cold wind whipped past the balcony. Thank you for being honest. I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned around, pushed open the heavy glass door, and stepped back into the hot, loud, thumping noise of the party. I walked straight past the kitchen, straight past Fiona who called my name in alarm from the hallway, and straight out the front door into the freezing Manhattan night. I walked 3 blocks down Street Mark's place before the first tear finally spilled over my eyelashes, burning cold against my cheek. I looked up at the gray, cloud-covered night sky, listening to the distant blare of taxi horns and the hum of a city that never cared who was broken-hearted. I am never going to feel that way about you. He had answered the question. He had drawn the line. And as I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering in the autumn cold, I knew the hardest part wasn't that he didn't love me. The hardest part was that I had spent 3 years begging a man to see me, only to realize he had been looking right at me the whole time and simply didn't like what he saw. The morning sun did not break gently over Brooklyn. It cut through the sheer white curtains of my 3rd-floor apartment on East 7th Street like a cold, unforgiving blade. My head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache not from alcohol, because I barely touched 3 sips of that sickly sweet punch, but from 3 uninterrupted hours of silent, humiliating crying into my pillow. My eyes were swollen, heavy, and hot. I lay motionless on my back, staring up at the white plaster ceiling, watching the shadow of a bare tree branch sway in the autumn wind. It makes me uncomfortable, Claire. The sentence replayed in my mind on an endless, brutal loop. Every time my brain reached the word uncomfortable, a fresh wave of cold shame washed down my spine. I sat up slowly, my dark brown hair tangled wildly around my face. I looked across my bedroom at my desk. It was covered in yellow legal pads filled with notes on civil engineering terms, scale drawings of bridges I had looked up just so I could talk to him about his classes, and 3 unused, beautifully designed leather journals I had bought last month because I heard him say his current sketchbook was running out of grid paper. I had built an entire world out of his peripheral interests. I was a museum dedicated to a boy who had never even bought a ticket to enter. The front door of our apartment clicked open, followed by the soft rustle of paper grocery bags and the heavy clunk of a coffee tray being set down on the kitchen counter. Claire? Fiona's voice called out softly from the hallway. Are you awake, honey? I took a shaky breath, pressing the palms of my hands against my tired eyes before throwing back the duvet. Yeah, I called out, my voice raspy and thin. I'm up. I pulled on an oversized knit sweater, a dark, muted gray, and stepped out into the sunlit living room. Fiona, Vivian, and Sophie were already there, gathered around the small wooden dining table like a war council. Fiona was pouring freshly brewed espresso into 4 ceramic mugs, while Vivian was aggressively slathering cream cheese onto toasted sesame bagels. The second Fiona saw my face, her posture softened. She set the coffee pot down, walked straight over to me, and wrapped her arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a warm, tight hug that smelled of cocoa butter and roasted espresso. Oh, Claire, Fiona whispered softly, rubbing my back in long, slow circles. I'm so sorry. I didn't cry this time. The tears had run completely dry sometime around 4 a.m. I just rested my forehead against her shoulder for 5 seconds, leaning into the warmth of someone who actually wanted me around, before pulling back with a weak, tired smile. I'm okay, I said softly, sliding into the empty chair between Vivian and Sophie. You are not okay, and you don't have to pretend to be, Vivian said sternly, though she gently pushed a toasted bagel and a steaming mug of black coffee, my coffee, oat milk with a splash of vanilla, toward my hands. What did he say? I picked up the mug, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic to stop the faint trembling in my fingers. He told me to stop. He said my attention makes him uncomfortable. He said he's never going to feel that way about me, and that I'm wasting my time. Sophie winced, placing a soft, comforting hand over my knuckles. Claire. God, that's brutal. It was necessary, I said quietly, looking down at the dark liquid in my cup. He wasn't wrong, Sophie. I was being embarrassing. I was pushing and pushing, expecting a different outcome just because I cared so much. I thought love was a transaction. I thought if I put enough effort in, he'd have to return it. It wasn't embarrassing, Claire, Fiona snapped gently, her dark eyes fierce as she sat down across from me. You loved someone with everything you had. That is not something to be ashamed of. Ethan Whitman is just, he's blind. He is emotionally stunted, he is obsessed with a girl who looks at him like he is a piece of furniture, and he doesn't know what a good thing looks like when it's standing right in front of him. It doesn't matter anymore, I said softly, taking a slow sip of the hot coffee. The caffeine washed down my throat, grounding me. He made his boundary clear. And I'm going to respect it. Vivian raised an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. Meaning? Meaning I'm done, I said. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, heavy, foreign, but oddly steady. I'm not going to bring him coffee. I'm not going to sit outside the engineering building. I'm not going to save him seats, or fix his graphics, or reroute my entire morning just to walk past his dormitory. If he wants to live his life without me in it, I am finally going to let him. The three of them stared at me for a long, quiet moment. Fiona leaned forward, her sharp gaze searching my face, looking for any sign of a bluff. Do you mean it this time, Claire? Because we've been down this road before. 2 weeks later, he smiles at you or mentions he is stressed, and you're back to baking matcha cookies. I mean it, I said, looking Fiona straight in the eyes. I'm not doing this to make him miss me. I'm not doing it as some game show tactic to get his attention. I'm doing it because I'm exhausted, Fiona. I don't want to hurt anymore. Vivian let out a low, satisfied breath, cracking a small, rare smile. Finally. The Queen has returned to her senses. It's going to be hard, Sophie reminded me gently, her green-gray eyes full of warmth. You two have the same friend group. You're going to see him at Kimmel, at Joe's, at group dinners. Then I'll be polite, I replied, setting my mug down with a soft, decisive clink. I'll be calm. I'll be friendly. But I won't be his Claire anymore. By noon, the clouds had cleared, leaving a bright, crisp sky over Washington Square Park. The park was alive with the sounds of street musicians, laughter, and the rustle of amber leaves skittering across the pavement. I walked toward the Elmer Holmes Bob's library, my heavy leather tote bag slung over my shoulder. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't glance toward the concrete steps outside the civil engineering department. I didn't check my phone to see if Ethan had posted a story or texted the group chat. I walked straight past the coffee shop on Mercer Street without stopping. I reached the 5th floor of Bob's, finding a quiet single desk by the massive glass window overlooking the park. I pulled out my laptop, my color-coded planner, and a blank notebook. I opened my phone, pulled up Ethan's contact profile, Ethan Engineering, and slowly turned off his notifications. I didn't delete his number. I didn't block him. Deleting him felt like a grand, dramatic gesture, and I didn't want drama anymore. I just wanted quiet. My phone buzzed a minute later. A text in the big group chat. Lucas, study group at Kimmel 10th floor at 3 p.m. Who's in? I need someone to explain soil mechanics before I lose my mind. Derek, I'll be there. Olivia, Ethan and I are grabbing lunch first, but we'll come up around 3:30. Ethan, yeah. I looked at the screen for 3 seconds. In the past, I would have immediately replied, adjusting my schedule, skipping my marketing reading, just to sit at the edge of that table for 2 hours hoping Ethan would look up from his screen. I closed the group chat. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my email and drafted a message to my professor regarding an advanced marketing strategy project I wanted to lead for the spring semester. I spent the next 3 hours typing, building a presentation deck, concentrating on my own fonts, my own metrics, and my own future. When 3:30 p.m. came and went, I was still sitting by the window in Bob's library. The sun began to dip behind the West Village skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the wooden table. My fingers flew across the keyboard, steady and uninterrupted. For 3 years, I had believed my world revolved around Ethan Whitman-esque gravity. But as the golden light filled the quiet library, I realized something simple and startling. The sun was still rising without him. My heart was still beating. And for the very first time in my adult life, I belonged entirely to myself. The second week of October brought a bitter, persistent chill that rolled off the East River, turning the trees around Washington Square into skeletal, amber-draped fingers. In the past, cold weather was my absolute favorite excuse. Cold weather meant I could bring Ethan hot coffee instead of cold brew. It meant I could offer him the extra knit scarf I kept in my bag, or nag him about wearing a light jacket when the wind picked up along 4th Street. Caring for Ethan Whitman in the autumn had been an Olympic sport, and I had trained for it with pathetic, relentless enthusiasm. Now, I just pulled my dark green wool coat tighter around my shoulders, buried my hands in my warm pockets, and walked straight past the library steps without looking back. I had established a new routine. It was surprisingly easy once the initial, hollow shock faded into a quiet, manageable ache. At 8:30 a.m., I bought 1 coffee, a large vanilla oat latte from a tiny espresso bar near my apartment. At 9 a.m., I sat in the front row of my consumer psychology lecture, taking meticulous notes in my neat, dark brown cursive. By 3 p.m., I was working in the quiet, sunlit corner of the marketing lab on the 4th floor of Shimkin Hall, far away from the civil engineering building. I didn't avoid the group completely. That would have been dramatic, and I refused to give Ethan's rejection the power to isolate me from my friends. When we all met for group dinners at the diner on West 3rd, I went. I sat next to Fiona and Vivian, I laughed at Lucas's ridiculous stories, I ate my fries, and I joined in the conversations. But when Ethan spoke, I listened with polite, distant composure. I didn't tease him. I didn't lean across the table to hand him napkins. I didn't ask him how his structural design projects were going. I treated him exactly like I treated Derek or Gavin, with casual, friendly indifference. It turns out, indifference is a terrifyingly quiet thing. "He's losing his mind," Lucas whispered conspiratorially, sliding into the booth next to me at the Silver Dollar Diner on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The diner was packed, smelling of fried onions, maple syrup, and stale coffee. Fiona and Sophie were sitting across from us, sharing a massive plate of waffle fries. I didn't look up from my laptop, where I was tweaking the typography for an upcoming campus campaign. "Who is?" "Ethan," Lucas said, leaning in so close his shoulder bumped mine. He lowered his voice to a theatrical whisper. "The man is malfunctioning, Claire." Yesterday in fluid dynamics, Dr. Hale asked him for his lab write-up, and Ethan spent 2 full minutes looking through his backpack for a blue sticky note. My fingers paused over the trackpad. I kept my face entirely smooth. Why would he look for a sticky note? "Because you always wrote his lab reminders on blue sticky notes," Lucas exclaimed, throwing his hands up in the air. He literally muttered, "Where's the reminder?" out loud. Derek had to tell him that people usually write their own reminders on their phones like normal human beings. Fiona let out a sharp, triumphant snort into her soda cup, giving Lucas a look of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. "I'm sure he found it fine on his phone," I said calmly, taking a slow sip of my iced water. "Ethan is very organized." "He is not organized, he is a creature of habit," Lucas insisted. "And you were the habit." "Do you know what he said to me this morning when we walked past the Daily Grind?" He stopped, looked at the door, and went, "Did Claire mention if they changed their hazelnut syrup supplier?" I looked at him like he had 2 heads. I was like, "Bro, she hasn't brought you a coffee in 10 days. Why are you asking me about hazelnut syrup?" Sophie covered her mouth with a napkin to hide her giggle, while Vivian, who had just walked up to the booth carrying 2 milkshakes, sat down on the end and crossed her legs neatly. "Did he look sad?" Vivian asked with cold, analytical interest. "He didn't look sad, he looked confused," Lucas corrected, stealing a waffle fry from Fiona's plate. "Like a dog that's been staring at a closed door for an hour waiting for someone to open it, but nobody's on the other side." "Good," Fiona declared firmly. "Let him starve." "Guys, please," I said softly, finally closing my laptop screen with a quiet click. I looked at my friends, offering them a small, genuine smile. It's fine. Ethan isn't starving, he's just adjusting. When someone stops doing favors for you after 3 years, it takes a few days to notice the change in routine. It's just muscle memory. It's not just muscle memory, Lucas argued, leaning back against the red vinyl booth. He keeps looking at the door whenever we're studying at Kimmel. Every time the elevator dings, his head snaps up. Yesterday, Gavin walked in carrying a bag from the bakery, and Ethan literally reached his hand out before he realized Gavin wasn't you. A strange, quiet knot tightened in my chest. For 3 long years, I would have traded my soul to know that Ethan Whitman was looking for me in a room. I would have dissected Lucas's words, analyzed every detail, and convinced myself that his confusion was secretly love waiting to bloom. But sitting in that red vinyl booth, listening to rain rattle against the diner glass, I didn't feel thrilled. I just felt a deep, melancholic clarity. He didn't miss me. He missed the convenience. He missed the quiet, steady stream of adoration that had cushioned his chaotic engineering schedule for 3 years. He missed the girl who made him feel important without ever asking for anything in return. He'll get used to it, I said quietly, sliding my laptop back into my leather tote. I stood up, pulling my coat on. I have to head to my 4 p.m. presentation. I'll see you guys tonight? Text us when you're done, honey, Fiona said, reaching up to gently pat my wrist. I nodded, waving goodbye to the table, and pushed open the heavy diner door. The walk across Washington Square Park was cold and wet, the pavement slick with fallen yellow leaves. Steam rose from the subway grates along 4th Street, masking the city in a light, atmospheric haze. I was crossing the paved plaza near the central fountain when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Claire. I stopped. I didn't jump. My heart didn't do its usual dramatic, fluttering cartwheel against my ribs. It just gave a heavy, slow thud. I turned around slowly. Ethan was standing a few feet away, holding a black umbrella over his head. He was wearing his heavy charcoal wool coat over a navy sweater, his dark hair slightly damp around his temples from the mist. He looked tall, sharp, and broad-shouldered against the backdrop of the gray park. He took 2 long steps toward me, stopping just close enough that the edge of his umbrella hovered over my head, shielding me from the light drizzle. Hey, Ethan, I said smoothly. My voice was calm, polite, and completely devoid of the breathless excitement that used to lace every word I spoke to him. What's up? Ethan stared at me for a long, quiet second. His green eyes were sharp, scanning my face with a strange, uncharacteristic intensity as if he were trying to read a blueprint that had suddenly been rewritten in a language he didn't understand. You weren't at Kimmel today, he said. It wasn't a question, it was a simple, flat observation. No, I replied, resting my hands in the pockets of my wool coat. I'm working on a team campaign in the business building library this week. Less distraction. Ethan shifted his grip on the handle of his umbrella. He lowered his gaze slightly, looking at my shoulder, then back up at my eyes. Lucas said you were at the diner, he continued, his tone carrying that same quiet, hesitant thread. I went by, but you had already left. Yeah, I had a 4 p.m. presentation, I explained patiently, keeping my smile small and friendly. Did you need something? A copy of the notes for the group project, or? No, Ethan said quickly. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly as he looked out over the wet park, then back at me. No, I didn't need anything. He stood there for 3 long, quiet seconds. The rain tapped rhythmically against the nylon fabric of his umbrella. In the past, I would have filled that silence immediately. I would have asked him about his classes, offered to walk with him to his next lab, or teased him about looking tired. I would have thrown a dozen conversational lifelines just to keep him standing next to me for 2 more minutes. Now, I just stood there, letting the silence rest between us. Ethan seemed to feel the weight of it, the sheer, staggering absence of my effort. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Are you coming to the group dinner at the Thai place on Saturday? He asked softly. I think so, I replied gently. Fiona mentioned it. If I finish my case study by 7, I'll definitely be there. Okay, Ethan said. He looked down at the umbrella handle, his green eyes clouded with a quiet, unreadable frustration. Good. We haven't talked in a while. We saw each other at Joe's Pizza on Tuesday, Ethan, I reminded him with a small, polite laugh that didn't reach my eyes. that was different, he murmured, almost to himself. He looked directly into my brown eyes, his voice dropping into a low, grounded tone. You barely said 2 words to me. I looked up at him at the handsome, familiar lines of his face, the sharp jawline, the clear green eyes that I had spent 3 years worshipping like a holy religion. You asked for space, Ethan, I said softly, my voice devoid of anger, bitterness, or spite. It was just the plain, honest truth. I'm just giving it to you. Ethan went completely still. The words didn't fly out like an accusation, they sat between us in the cold October rain, solid and unyielding. He didn't have an engineering formula to rebut it. He didn't have a logical defense. He had drawn a line on a fire escape balcony 2 weeks ago, and I had simply stepped behind it and closed the door. I should get to my lecture, I said gently, stepping out from beneath the dry canopy of his umbrella into the light, cool rain. Don't get soaked, Ethan. See you Saturday. I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned and walked down the wet pavement toward Shimkin Hall, my boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. Behind me, Ethan Whitman didn't move. He stood alone in the middle of Washington Square Park, holding an umbrella over empty space, watching the girl who used to chase him walk away without looking back once. The rain had cleared by Saturday evening, leaving behind a crisp, biting chill that swept through the concrete corridors of Lower Manhattan. The restaurant was a dimly lit, narrow Thai spot on Bleecker Street called Chata. The air inside was warm, fragrant with lemongrass, crushed peanuts, toasted chili, and coconut milk. Steam condensed against the narrow front windows, blurring the yellow glow of string lights hanging above the crowded tables. Our usual group had taken over a long wooden table in the back corner. I am telling you, if I have to read one more case study on market segmentation, my brain is going to melt out of my ears, Fiona announced, dramatically dropping her head onto Vivian's shoulder. You've been complaining for 20 minutes, Fi, Vivian said calmly, using her chopstick to push a stray peanut off her plate. Eat your pad see-ew and gain some sustenance. Claire understands me, Fiona insisted, sitting up and pointing a fork at me. Claire, tell her that advanced marketing is human torture. It's torture, I agreed with a small laugh, pouring jasmine tea into my small ceramic cup. But at least Professor Hale gives extra credit if your final campaign pitch beats the client metrics. I was sitting in the middle of the long bench, wearing a thick, oversized cream cable knit sweater with my dark brown hair pulled back into a messy, soft low bun. My face was flushed from the heat of the room, my cheeks warm, my smile easy. Directly across from me sat Ethan. He hadn't said more than 3 words since we sat down. He was wearing a fitted charcoal sweater, his long legs tucked back under the narrow table to avoid brushing against mine. Every time I shifted, or leaned forward to speak to Fiona, his green eyes flicked toward me sharp, observant, and heavy with a quiet, restless frustration. Beside him sat Olivia. She looked effortless as always, wearing a soft lavender cardigan, her honey blonde hair resting over one shoulder. She was leaning close to Ethan, whispering something about an art history exhibition in Chelsea that she wanted him to go to with her next weekend. Ethan, Olivia said softly, touching his forearm with her manicured fingers. Are you even listening to me? Ethan blinked, his attention snapping away from my hands resting on my teacup. He turned his head slowly to look at Olivia. Sorry, Ethan said, his low baritone slightly gravelly. What did you say? I asked if you wanted to come to the gallery opening on Saturday, Olivia repeated, her brows knitting together in slight confusion. You've been completely spacey all night. Are you tired? I'm fine, Ethan replied quietly. He didn't look at her with that soft, eager focus he usually possessed. Instead, his gaze drifted right back across the table, landing on me just as I let out a genuine, breathless laugh at something Lucas said. And then, Lucas was loudly exclaiming to the whole table, Gavin tried to use a blowtorch on his balsa wood model. A blowtorch, Claire. The entire lab smelled like a campfire for 3 hours. It was controlled heat. Gavin protested defensively from the end of the table. It was an arson attempt, Derek corrected stoically without looking up from his curry. I laughed, shaking my head. Gavin, please tell me you didn't burn down the engineering basement. I saved the frame. Gavin insisted. As the table burst into another round of chaotic banter, I reached for the small glass bottle of soy sauce near the center of the table. My fingers hovered over it, but before I could grab it, Ethan's hand moved. He picked up the bottle and set it right next to my teacup. Thanks, I said softly, giving him a brief, polite nod. I didn't smile. I didn't meet his eyes for more than a second. I just poured a splash onto my dumplings and set the bottle back down. Ethan's jaw clenched. He withdrew his hand, his fingers curling into a tight fist on top of his napkin. He stared at me, really stared at me, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. For 3 years, a gesture as small as him handing me the soy sauce would have sent me into a spiral of giddy hope. I would have beamed, thanked him profusely, and spent 20 minutes trying to start a side conversation with him. Now, I just passed the dumplings to Sophie. Ethan? Olivia asked again, her voice laced with a subtle hint of insecurity that I had never heard in her before. She tightened her grip on his arm. So? Saturday? The gallery? Ethan didn't look at Olivia. He kept his green eyes fixed on my face as I leaned back, chatting comfortably with Fiona about our weekend plans. I can't, Olivia, Ethan said flatly, his voice carrying a cold, distracted edge. I have a project. Olivia pulled her hand back slightly, looking thoroughly stunned. Oh. Okay. You usually come to the openings with me. I'm busy, Ethan said simply. The tension at our end of the table shifted, tight and awkward. Lucas glanced between Ethan and me, his eyes wide, before quickly burying his face in his glass of iced tea. An hour later, the dinner ended, and our large group spilled out onto the chilly sidewalk of Bleecker Street. The crisp autumn air hit us instantly, steam billowing from our mouths as we said our goodbyes. We're heading toward the subway at West 4th, Vivian said, wrapping her scarf around her neck. Claire, you coming with us? Yeah, just give me a second, I said, reaching into my bag to find my transit card. A few feet away, Olivia was putting on her coat. She looked at Ethan, waiting for him to walk her back to her dorm like he always did. Ethan, Olivia said gently, stepping closer to him. Are you walking uptown? Ethan turned to her. His broad shoulders were tense under his heavy coat, his dark hair ruffled by the wind. Lucas can walk you back, Olivia, Ethan said quietly, his tone polite but entirely final. I need to talk to Claire. Olivia froze. Her pale cheeks flushed pink, her blue-green eyes wide with sudden, sharp surprise. She looked from Ethan to me, her lips parting slightly, as if she couldn't quite process the fact that Ethan Whitman, the boy who had followed her around like a loyal shadow since childhood, was turning her down to stand in the cold with me. Oh, Olivia whispered, swallowing hard. She pulled her trench coat tighter around herself. Okay. Yeah. That's fine. Lucas stepped up quickly, sensing the weird, crackling energy in the air. Yeah. I'm heading uptown anyway, Olivia. I'll walk with you. Olivia offered a tight, forced smile, nodding once at Ethan before walking away with Lucas, Derek, and Gavin. Fiona gave me a long, meaningful look from down the block, silently asking if I needed an escape route. I gave her a small nod to tell her I was fine, and she walked off with Vivian and Sophie. Within 2 minutes, the crowded sidewalk cleared. It was just the two of us standing outside the glowing yellow windows of the Thai restaurant. The street was quiet, save for the distant rumble of a subway car passing beneath the iron grates down the block. Ethan stepped closer. Without the group, without the noise, his physical presence felt immense, broad, tall, and suffocatingly intense. Why are you doing this, Claire? He asked. His voice was low, rough, and strained. I looked up at him, my dark brown hair blowing slightly in the wind. Doing what, Ethan? This, he said, gesturing vaguely between us with a broad hand. You're acting like I'm a stranger. You sit across from me, you don't look at me, you barely talk to me. You treat me like I'm just one of Lucas's random friends. I treat you with respect, Ethan, I said calmly, keeping my hands in my coat pockets. I'm polite. I'm friendly. It's not friendly. Ethan snapped, his composure cracking for the first time in 3 years. His green eyes burned with frustration, a deep crease forming between his brows. It's cold, Claire. It's like you turned off a switch overnight. You asked me to turn it off. I raised my voice slightly, though my tone remained steady, grounded, and unshakable. Ethan went rigid. You sat on a fire escape 2 weeks ago, I continued softly, looking him straight in the eyes, and you told me that my attention made you uncomfortable. You told me I was wasting my time, and that you were never going to feel the same way about me. Do you remember saying that? Ethan swallowed hard, his throat working as he stared down at me. The color drained slightly from his face. I was trying to set boundaries. And I accepted them, I said quietly. I stopped making you uncomfortable, Ethan. I stopped giving you things you didn't ask for. I stopped pushing myself into your life. Isn't this what you wanted? Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He stood there in the cold Manhattan night, the brilliant, logical engineer who always had an answer for every formula, completely silenced by his own words. He had spent 3 years wishing I would stop chasing him. He had spent 3 years treating my devotion like an annoying, persistent background noise. And now that the noise was gone, he was realizing that the quiet was deafening. I have to get home, I said gently, pulling my coat around myself. Good night, Ethan. I turned and walked toward the West 4th Street subway station. Ethan Whitman didn't follow me. He couldn't. He stood under the dim street lamp on Bleecker Street, watching my dark hair disappear into the stairs, realizing for the very first time that the boundary he had built so carefully wasn't keeping me out. It had trapped him inside, completely alone. Newton's first law of motion states that an object in motion will stay in motion, and an object at rest will stay at rest, unless acted upon by an external force. For 3 years, I had been the object in motion. I had run on pure, unadulterated hope, generating enough momentum for both Ethan and me. I assumed that if I stopped, the entire world would suffer a catastrophic derailment. It turned out the world kept spinning smoothly on its axis. By the 3rd week of October, my life had recalibrated into an exquisite, satisfying rhythm. I had pitched a brand activation strategy for a sustainable fashion pop-up in Soho, and my professor had chosen my group to present directly to the client. I spent my afternoons in the high-ceilinged, sunlit studios of the Tisch building, debating color theory and narrative arcs with people who hung on my every word, people who valued my mind instead of auditing my structural physics. I felt light. For the first time since I moved to New York, my chest didn't ache with the constant, heavy anxiety of waiting for a text that would never come. Ethan Whitman, on the other hand, was rapidly unraveling. He's losing his mind, Claire. I'm not exaggerating this time. The structural integrity of Ethan Whitman has compromised, Lucas declared, dropping his heavy canvas backpack onto the wooden table with a dramatic thud. We were sitting in the open courtyard outside the Brown building. It was a crisp, clear afternoon, yellow oak leaves tumbling across the stone pavers in the autumn breeze. I was sitting on a stone bench, sipping a warm chai latte, my laptop resting on my knees as I reviewed slide transitions. I didn't look up from my screen. Lucas, he scored a 98 on his advanced hydraulics exam on Monday. He's fine. He put salt in his coffee yesterday. Lucas shouted, leaning down so his face was level with mine. Salt, Claire. I watched him pour 2 packets of sea salt into his dark roast, take a huge gulp, spit it across the kitchen sink, and then stare at the mug like it had personally betrayed him. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. A small, involuntary twinge of pity flickered in my stomach, but I quickly smoothed my expression. He's probably just stressed about midterms. He's not stressed about midterms. He's stressed about you. Lucas sat down beside me on the bench, taking off his baseball cap and running a hand through his messy hair. His face was surprisingly serious. Look, Claire. I know Ethan can be an emotionally stunted brick wall. I know he hurt your feelings. But the guy hasn't slept more than 3 hours a night since the party at St. Mark's. Lucas, I said softly, turning my head to face him. Ethan told me very clearly that my presence made him uncomfortable. I am simply respecting his boundary. Isn't that what a good friend is supposed to do? Lucas looked at me, his eyes wide and helpless. Yeah, but, he didn't mean it like this. He thought you were going to back off 10%. He didn't expect you to drop to absolute zero. I don't do things by halves, I said gently, closing my laptop screen with a quiet click. I gave him everything I had for 3 years, Lucas. He didn't want it. So now, I'm keeping it for myself. Lucas stared at me for a long moment, then let out a heavy, defeated sigh. Damn. You really mean it, don't you? I really do. He's gonna drown, Lucas muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he stood up. The idiot is literally going to drown in his own stubbornness. At 5 p.m., I walked down the grand marble staircase of the Bobst Library, my coat pulled tight against the late afternoon chill. The sky was turning a bruised, vibrant shade of purple and orange over the arches of Washington Square Park. I was reaching into my bag for my headphones when a figure stepped out from behind one of the massive stone pillars at the base of the steps, cutting off my path. I stopped short. Ethan stood right in front of me. He wasn't wearing his usual crisp, composed look. His dark hair was chaotic, sticking up as if he had run his hands through it 100 times. Dark, bruised shadows hung under his striking green eyes, and his jaw was covered in a rough, dark stubble he usually shaved off every morning. He looked exhausted, frayed, and entirely unmoored. "Claire," he said. His voice was raspy, low, and heavy. "Ethan," I replied, my tone neutral, polite, and calm. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you," he said plainly, taking a step closer. The scent of rain, cold air, and his familiar cedarwood cologne washed over me. "I've been waiting here for an hour." "You could have texted," I said mildly. Though I was in a lecture, so I wouldn't have seen it. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his charcoal coat. He looked down at me, his green eyes burning with a desperate, chaotic energy I had never seen in him before. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Ethan, I have a group project meeting in 20 minutes at." "Cancel it," he interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. I blinked, genuinely stunned by the sharp demand. "Excuse me?" Ethan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting out a ragged breath. He pressed the heels of his palms against his temples, taking a step back as if trying to reassemble his usual logical composure. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice dropping into a rough whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to order you around." He opened his eyes, looking at me with a raw, agonizing vulnerability that made my heart hammer against my ribs. "Please, Claire. Just 10 minutes. Please." I looked at him, at the boy who had spent 3 years maintaining a flawless, unshakable perimeter around his life, now practically unraveling on the library steps. 10 minutes, I said quietly. "Let us walk." We walked side by side toward the quieter, tree-lined paths near the north side of the park. The silence between us was heavy, vibrating with a tense, unsaid pressure. In the past, I would have filled every second with light-hearted banter to make him comfortable. Now, I let the silence stretch, forcing him to bear the weight of his own request. "I went to the daily grind this morning," Ethan began softly, his boots crunching over the fallen leaves. "Did you?" "Yeah," he said, staring straight ahead. "I ordered an iced hazelnut cold brew." He paused, a self-deprecating, bitter smile touching his lips. "It tasted terrible. I don't even like hazelnut." I kept my eyes on the path ahead. "You like black cold brew. You only drank the hazelnut because I brought it." "I know," Ethan whispered. He stopped walking, turning to face me completely under the yellow glow of a street lamp. "I knew it then, too. But I drank it every single time because you brought it to me." I looked up at him, my expression unreadable. "Ethan, what is this?" "I don't know." Ethan blurted out, his voice echoing in the quiet park. He threw his hands out, his composure completely shattering. "I don't know what this is, Claire. My whole life is structured. I have blueprints, I have math, I have load distributions. Everything makes sense. But for the last 3 weeks, nothing makes sense." "Because I stopped bringing you coffee?" I asked gently. "Because you stopped looking at me," he yelled softly, stepping right into my personal space, his tall frame looming over me, his green eyes fierce and desperate. "You look through me, Claire. You sit across from me at dinner, and you laugh with Lucas, you talk to Fiona, you smile at everyone else in the room, and when your eyes hit me, you just turn off. It's like I'm a wall. It's like I don't exist." My chest heaved, a sharp spike of anger finally piercing through my calm, cool armor. "And how did it feel?" I asked softly, my voice dropping to an icy, deadly whisper. Ethan froze. "What? How did it feel, Ethan?" I stepped closer to him, looking him dead in the eyes, refusing to back down. "How did it feel to sit in a room with someone, to be right next to them, and realize they are looking right through you? How did it feel to realize that your presence means nothing to them?" Ethan stared at me, his lips parted, the color completely draining from his face as my words struck him like a physical blow. "Because I felt that for 3 years," I said, my voice trembling slightly with the weight of buried tears I refused to let fall. "Every single day. I stood next to you, I cared for you, I poured my heart into every small detail of your life and you looked right past me to see Olivia. You treated my love like a chore. You told me to my face that I made you uncomfortable. Claire, Ethan reached his hand out, his fingers trembling, as if he wanted to touch my shoulder, to hold me, to stop the words. No, I said, taking a step back, out of his reach. You don't get to be angry now, Ethan. You don't get to be upset because I finally gave you what you begged me for. You wanted me to stop. I stopped. You wanted your space. You have it. I was wrong. Ethan choked out. The words tore out of his throat, raw, ugly, and desperate. He took another step toward me, his green eyes swimming with a terrifying, uncharacteristic panic. I was wrong, Claire, he repeated, his voice cracking violently. I thought I wanted the quiet. I thought I wanted you to move on so I wouldn't feel guilty. But I didn't know. God, Claire, I didn't know it would feel like this. Like what? I whispered. Ethan pulled his hand back, pressing it hard against his own chest, right over his heart. He looked at me, completely stripped of his pride, his logic, his engineering, and his arrogance. Like I'm suffocating, he whispered. It feels like the whole world lost its weight, and I'm just floating around waiting to crash. I looked at him for a long, quiet 10 seconds. 3 weeks ago, those words would have brought me to my knees. I would have wrapped my arms around his neck, kissed his jaw, and promised him that I would never leave again. But standing in the cold October park, watching the boy I had worshipped unravel in front of me, I realized something terrible and profound. The girl who would have saved him had died on a fire escape balcony 3 weeks ago. And the woman standing here in her place wasn't going to destroy her own peace just to cushion his fall. I'm sorry you're hurting, Ethan, I said softly, my tone deeply sincere, but devastatingly final. I really am. But you're an engineer. You'll figure out how to adjust to the new layout. I turned my back on him. Claire. Ethan called out behind me, his voice echoing through the bare trees, thick with a desperation that broke the evening silence. Claire, please. I didn't stop. I walked down the paved path, my head held high, my dark brown hair catching the wind, leaving Ethan Whitman standing alone in the dark, breathing in the cold, empty air of a world he had designed all by himself. The first rule of structural failure is that a system never collapses all at once. It happens in microfractures, invisible, internal cracks that expand silently under tension until the load becomes too heavy to bear. By the last week of October, the cracks in Ethan Whitman's carefully constructed world were no longer invisible. He's not eating, Lucas reported, dropping a heavy plastic tray onto our table at the Kimmel Center lounge. It was a gray, overcast Tuesday afternoon. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, low clouds hung over Washington Square Park like wet cotton. Fiona glanced up from her tablet, where she was helping me fine-tune the typography for our final market analysis pitch. Lucas, if you're about to deliver another dramatic monologue about Ethan Whitman's tragic digestive system, I am going to pour my iced tea over your head. I am serious. Lucas sat down hard, leaning over his turkey sandwich with a scowl. The guy bought a bagel at 8 this morning, took one bite, and left the rest on his desk. He has been sitting in the structural lab since 10, staring at a CAD model he finished 3 days ago. I kept my hands on my keyboard, my expression remaining perfectly serene. He's probably fine, Lucas. He has the senior design review coming up. It's not the design review, Claire, Lucas said, his voice dropping into a quiet, serious register that made both Fiona and me look at him. He tried to talk to Olivia yesterday. My fingers paused over the spacebar. Across from me, Fiona's eyes narrowed into sharp, dangerous slits. And Olivia told him she's seeing someone, Lucas said softly. Some guy from her modern art seminar. A senior. She said she tried to tell Ethan last week, but he was too distracted to listen. A heavy, sudden silence fell over the table. For 3 years, Olivia Clark had been the quiet, untouchable sun around which Ethan Whitman's emotional solar system rotated. She was the childhood memory, the unrequited affection, the gentle, lingering what if that Ethan held on to whenever life felt too complicated. I waited for the old, familiar twist of jealousy to tear through my stomach. I waited for that bitter, phantom ache that usually hit whenever Olivia's name was spoken in connection to his. It didn't come. Instead, all I felt was a strange, hollow pity, a quiet, distant sadness for a boy who had built his life on two different illusions, a girl who would never choose him, and a girl who would never stop. How did he take it? Fiona asked, her tone surprisingly devoid of its usual venom. He didn't yell or anything, Lucas murmured, tracing a circle on the laminate table with his thumb. He just nodded, said that's great, Olivia, I'm happy for you, and walked out of the room. But I've known Ethan since we were 12. He looked empty. Like someone sucked all the air out of him. Good, Vivian muttered as she joined our table, sliding her sleek black laptop out of her tote. Maybe now he knows how unrequited love actually tastes. A little dose of humility builds character. Vivian, Sophie chided softly, sitting down next to her with a sympathetic sigh. It still sucks to watch a friend crash. He didn't crash, Vivian replied smoothly, opening her deck. He just met reality. I closed my laptop screen, leaning back against the high wooden booth. I looked out the massive window at the city below, the yellow taxis creeping along Mercer Street, the students huddled under umbrellas, the dark, slick asphalt reflecting the gloomy gray sky. He had lost Olivia. The girl he loved couldn't choose him. And the girl who had spent 3 years choosing him above everything else, was gone, too. By 7 p.m., a steady, freezing rain had begun to fall over Greenwich Village. I left the Tisch building alone, pulling my heavy olive coat tight around my throat, my dark brown hair tucked under the collar to protect it from the damp wind. I walked quickly down the slick sidewalk toward the subway station, my leather boots making sharp, rhythmic clicking sounds against the pavement. As I turned the corner onto Waverly Place, a tall figure stepped out from the shadowy awning of a dark coffee shop. Claire. I stopped in my tracks. Ethan was standing in the rain. He wasn't holding an umbrella. He wasn't even wearing his heavy wool coat, just a dark gray cable knit sweater, dark jeans, and his worn leather jacket, which was already soaked through at the shoulders. His dark hair was plastered against his forehead, water dripping off his jawline. He looked completely undone. His green eyes, usually so cool, clear, and analytical, were bloodshot, shadowed, and wild with an emotion he clearly had no idea how to contain. Ethan, I said, my voice steady despite the sudden spike of wind between us. You're getting soaked. What are you doing out here? He took 3 long, aggressive strides toward me, stopping barely 2 feet away. The heat radiating off his body cut through the freezing rain, carrying the scent of damp leather, rain, and his cedarwood cologne. Olivia told me about her boyfriend, Ethan said. His voice was hoarse, rough, and completely stripped of his usual calm baritone. I heard, I said softly, keeping my hands in my coat pockets. I'm sorry, Ethan. I know how much she meant to you. Ethan let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like glass breaking underfoot. He ran a trembling hand through his wet hair, dragging it back from his face. She didn't mean anything, he choked out. I blinked, thrown off by the sharp, jagged words. Ethan. She didn't mean anything. Ethan repeated louder, stepping even closer, his tall frame looming over me in the dark, rain-swept street. I thought she did. For years, I thought. I was waiting for her to see me. I thought that was why I kept my distance from you. I thought I was saving space for someone else. He reached out, his long fingers grasping my wrists through the thick wool of my coat sleeves. His grip wasn't painful, but it was tight, desperate, and trembling violently. Ethan, let go, I said firmly, though my heart began to beat a fast, heavy rhythm against my ribs. No, Ethan whispered, his voice cracking horribly. He looked down at my face, his green eyes searching my brown ones with a terrifying, raw intensity. Listen to me, Claire. Please. Just listen to me. I've listened to you for 3 years. I shouted over the sound of the rain, my own composure finally fracturing. I listened when you told me you didn't love me. I listened when you told me to stop bringing you coffee. I listened when you told me on a fire escape that my devotion made you uncomfortable. I was a fool. Ethan roared, the sound echoing off the wet brick buildings around us. Water ran down his cheeks, mingling with the rain. He didn't care. He stood there, exposed and completely broken, holding onto my wrists like a drowning man clutching a lifeline in a storm. I was a coward, Claire, he gasped, his chest heaving under his wet sweater. I used Olivia as an excuse. I used her because she was safe, because she didn't demand anything from me, because loving her from a distance didn't require me to open my heart or risk getting hurt. But you. He tightened his grip, pulling me a fraction of an inch closer, his face inches from mine in the cold night. You came into my life like a wrecking ball, Ethan whispered, his voice dropping into an agonizing, broken plea. You cared too much. You saw right through me. You brought me coffee, you drew stupid little bridges on sticky notes, you stayed up with me, you looked at me like I was the only person in the room and it terrified me. I didn't know how to handle someone loving me like that. I didn't know what to do with it. I stared at him, my mouth slightly parted, the rain stinging my cheeks. So I pushed you away, Ethan whispered, tears finally spilling over his eyelids, cut clean by the rain. I built walls. I told myself I didn't want it. I convinced myself that if I was mean enough, clear enough, you'd stop, and I could go back to my quiet, organized, lonely little life. He closed his eyes for a second, a harsh sob catching in his throat. And then you stopped, he said softly, opening his eyes to look at me with absolute ruin. And my whole life fell apart. The wind whipped around us, howling down Waverly Place, scattering wet yellow leaves across the pavement. A month ago, even 2 weeks ago, this moment would have felt like the fulfillment of every prayer I had ever whispered into the dark. Hearing Ethan Whitman confess that he pushed me away out of fear, hearing him admit that losing me had shattered him, it was the exact fairy tale realization I had dreamed of for 3 long years. Ethan, I whispered, my voice thick with a strange, heavy grief. Is this because Olivia didn't choose you? Ethan froze. The question hung in the freezing air between us, razor sharp and devastatingly clear. What? Ethan breathed. Are you standing in the rain right now because you finally realize you love me? I asked, my brown eyes searching his wet, trembling face with relentless honesty. Or are you standing here because the girl you wanted didn't choose you, and you came looking for the girl who always would? Ethan looked at me as if I had struck him across the face. The color drained completely from his skin. His fingers loosened around my wrists, slipping away slowly, falling back to his sides. Claire, no, Ethan stammered, his voice filled with a sudden, suffocating panic. No, Claire, that's not what this is. I don't care about Olivia. I haven't cared about Olivia in weeks. It's you. It's always been you. It wasn't always me, Ethan, I said softly, my tone dripping with a quiet, heartbreaking reality. It was never me. I was the backup plan. I was the safety net. I was the girl who sat in the bleachers waiting for you to notice that I had been wearing your jersey the whole time. Claire, please, Ethan begged, taking a step toward me, reaching his hands out again. I love you. God help me, Claire, I love you. I didn't realize it until you stopped, but I love you. I took a slow step back, out of his reach. I looked at Ethan Whitman, the boy I had loved with every fiber of my soul, the boy who had occupied every corner of my thoughts for 3 long years. He stood in the pouring rain, broken, weeping, and desperate, offering me the exact words I had spent 1,000 nights praying to hear. She fell first. He fell harder. The words of my past echoed in my mind, but they didn't bring joy. They just brought an overwhelming, quiet clarity. I loved you first, Ethan, I whispered, tears finally welling in my own eyes, burning warm against the cold rain. I loved you so much that I forgot how to love myself. I spent 3 years begging you to choose me, but I never realized that the only person who needed to choose me was me. Claire, don't do this, Ethan sobbed, taking another desperate step forward, his voice completely wrecked. Don't leave me. Please. I'm not leaving you to be cruel, Ethan, I said, offering him a small, terribly sad, but profoundly gentle smile. I'm leaving because I deserve to be someone else's first choice. Not their realization. Not their lesson. And definitely not their consolation prize. I turned my back on him. Claire. Ethan screamed into the storm, his voice breaking into a ragged, helpless roar that echoed off the high walls of the street. Claire, please. I choose you. I choose you. I didn't turn around. I walked down Waverly Place through the freezing rain, my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces, not from sadness, but from the immense, terrifying power of finally choosing myself. Behind me, Ethan Whitman dropped to his knees on the wet asphalt, burying his face in his trembling hands, weeping bitterly into the empty, indifferent Manhattan night. The trouble with choosing yourself is that nobody tells you about the morning after. They tell you about the victory. They tell you about the empowering moment you turn your back and walk away into the cinematic rain, head high, shoulders back, holding the fragile, precious nucleus of your dignity intact. But they leave out the part where you wake up at 5 in the morning on a Sunday with a hollow, aching hole in your chest that feels suspiciously like grief. I lay in bed, wrapped tightly in my duvet, listening to the muffled hiss of the radiator in the corner of my room. My wrists still felt ghostly cold where Ethan's fingers had gripped them 12 hours ago. My ears still echoed with his voice, that low, usually composed baritone completely torn to shreds, screaming my name into the empty darkness of Waverly Place. I choose you. I choose you. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my face into my pillow. 3 years. 3 long, exhausting, humiliating years I had lived for those 4 words. I would have crawled over broken glass to hear him say them. I would have traded my degree, my pride, my peace of mind just to hold that sentence against my chest like a trophy. And when he finally gave it to me, all it felt like was ash. The kitchen door clicked softly outside. A few seconds later, the smell of dark roast coffee and sizzling butter drifted under my bedroom door. I pushed back the covers, pulled on my thick plush robe, and padded barefoot into the living room. Fiona was standing at the stove in a silk pajama set, flipping chocolate chip pancakes in a cast iron skillet. Vivian was sitting at the counter, her hair wrapped in a towel, quietly scanning the New York Times on her tablet. Sophie was sitting at the wooden table, holding 2 warm ceramic mugs. When I stepped into the room, all 3 of them went completely still. Fiona turned off the burner, setting the spatula down with a quiet, careful precision. She looked at my face, taking in my pale skin, my swollen eyes, and the exhaustion etched into every line of my frame. Lucas called us at midnight, Claire, Fiona said softly, her voice unusually subdued. I stopped near the edge of the kitchen island, wrapping my robe tighter around my waist. He did? He said Ethan showed up at the apartment at 11 p.m., Vivian chimed in, setting her tablet down flat. Soaked to the bone. Wouldn't he take off his coat, wouldn't he sit down, wouldn't he talk to anyone? Lucas said he sat on the floor of his bedroom for 4 hours staring at a wall before he finally fell asleep. Sophie looked up at me with profound, quiet sympathy. Lucas was terrified, Claire. He said he's never seen Ethan like that. Not even when his grandfather passed away. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat tight and painful. I sat down in the empty chair next to Sophie, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug she pushed toward me. He told me he loved me, I whispered to the dark surface of the coffee. Fiona came over, pulling up a chair and sitting directly across from me. And I told him no, I said. My voice didn't sound triumphant. It sounded broken, tired, and heavy with a strange, lingering sadness. I told him I wasn't going to be his consolation prize after Olivia. Vivian let out a slow, quiet breath, leaning her chin on her hand. Was he using you as a consolation prize, Claire? Truly? I looked up, meeting Vivian's sharp, analytical eyes. What do you mean? I mean, Vivian and I spent 3 years wanting to strangle the guy, Fiona interjected, her dark eyes searching my face gently. We watched him ignore you, we watched him give you cold answers, we watched him act like a complete brick wall while you poured your heart out. But Claire. Lucas said when Ethan came home last night, he wasn't mad. He wasn't thrown off because his ego took a hit. Lucas said Ethan was grieving. He was scared, Sophie added softly. A man who loses a backup plan gets angry or embarrassed. A man who loses the person he realizes he actually loves, gets destroyed. I stared at my friends, my chest aching with a violent, confused turbulence. It doesn't change anything, I whispered, shaking my head as a single, hot tear finally escaped my eyelashes, trailing down my cheek. It can't change anything. I spent 3 years losing myself trying to get him to see me. If I jump back into his arms the second he starts crying, what was all of this for? What happens if he gets comfortable again and goes back to being the same cold, distant Ethan Whitman? Nothing, Vivian said firmly, her tone leveling out into absolute clarity. You don't go back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Vivian's right, Fiona agreed, reaching across the table to cover my trembling hand with her own warm palm. Ethan Whitman spent 3 years taking you for granted because he believed you were a constant. He believed no matter how cold he was, no matter how many times he pushed you away, Claire Morgan would always be standing right there, waiting with a smile and a hot cup of coffee. Fiona leaned closer, her eyes fierce with protective love. If Ethan Whitman really loves you, Claire, she continued, then he needs to learn what life feels like when you aren't there to fix it for him. He needs to realize that love isn't something you claim when you finally get lonely. It's something you earn. And right now, he hasn't earned a damn thing. By Monday morning, the rain had cleared, leaving behind a sky so clear and blue it looked like polished glass. The autumn air was sharp and icy, freezing the puddles along the sidewalk of West 4th Street into thin sheets of translucent ice. I walked into the Shimkin Hall lobby at 8:45 a.m., holding my single vanilla oat latte, wearing my favorite camel-colored wool coat and a wide dark green scarf. My brown hair was curled, my berry lipstick was back, and though my heart still felt like a bruised, fragile weight inside my ribs, my stride was steady. I took the elevator up to the 5th floor and walked down the wide corridor toward my consumer psychology seminar. As I reached the wooden double doors of the lecture hall, I stopped. Ethan was standing by the window at the end of the hall. He wasn't hiding behind a pillar this time. He was standing right in the open, leaning against the radiator. He looked refined, but visibly worn. He was wearing a dark charcoal wool coat over a navy sweater, dark jeans, and clean leather boots. His hair was neat, but his skin was pale, and those striking green eyes bore dark, bruised shadows that no crisp coat could hide. When he saw me, he didn't run over. He didn't yell. He didn't grab my wrists. He simply stood up straight, taking 2 slow, deliberate steps toward me, then stopping 5 feet away, respecting the physical boundary I had drawn between us. The hallway was quiet, save for the distant chatter of students heading into adjacent classrooms. "Claire," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, and steady, though I could hear the microscopic tremor beneath the surface. I held my coffee cup with both hands, my expression calm and composed. "Ethan. You shouldn't be here. You have fluid dynamics in Brown Building right now." "I know," Ethan replied quietly. His green eyes locked onto mine with an unblinking, desperate focus that felt almost physical in its intensity. "I don't care about fluid dynamics." A small, sad smile touched my lips. The Ethan Whitman I knew would never skip a lab. "The Ethan Whitman you knew was an idiot," Ethan said plainly. The blunt, unvarnished honesty of his words hit the air between us like a heavy stone. Ethan took one small step closer, stopping just far enough that he wasn't intruding, but close enough that I could see the raw, terrifying sincerity burning in his eyes. "I didn't come here to beg you to change your mind today," Ethan said, his voice dropping into a low, grounded baritone. "And I didn't come here to make excuses. You were right about everything you said on Waverly Place. I was a coward. I used my work, I used my logic, and I used Olivia to build a wall because I was terrified of how much power you had over me." I swallowed hard, keeping my back straight, refusing to break under the sheer weight of his gaze. "Ethan. Let me finish," he requested softly, his tone pleading, but deeply respectful. "Please." I went quiet, letting him speak. "I know you think you were my second choice," Ethan continued, his chest rising and falling in a slow, painful rhythm. "I know you think I only came to you because Olivia didn't choose me. And I know I gave you every reason in the world to believe that. But that's the cruelest mistake I've ever made." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small, folded piece of blue paper, and held it out toward me. It was the sticky note from 3 weeks ago, the one I had drawn the silly, load-bearing bridge on, the one I had left on his cold brew at the daily grind. The paper was worn at the edges, folded and unfolded so many times the crease was almost white, but it was pristine, dry, and carefully kept. "I've carried this in my pocket every single day since you gave it to me," Ethan whispered, looking down at the small blue square, then back up into my eyes. "I didn't keep a single note Olivia ever wrote me. I didn't save her texts. I didn't think about her when I went to sleep. I thought about you, Claire. Every time I looked at a bridge, every time I sat at Kimmel, every time my phone buzzed. I was looking for you." My heart hammered a frantic, heavy beat against my ribs. Tears prickled at the back of my eyes, but I forced them down. "Ethan," I breathed. "You told me you deserved to be someone's first choice," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. He slowly pulled his hand back, folding the sticky note gently and tucking it back into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "You are my first choice, Claire. You are my only choice." It just took me losing my mind to realize that my whole world was already standing right in front of me. I stared at him, my mouth dry, the quiet hallway suddenly feeling miles away. I know you don't trust me, Ethan added quietly, taking a small step backward toward the elevator. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't get to fix 3 years of stupidity with one speech in a hallway. But I'm not going anywhere, Claire. He looked at me one last time, his green eyes dark, steady, and blazing with a fierce, unyielding devotion that I had spent 3 years praying to see. You spent 3 years chasing me, Ethan said softly, his voice echoing in the quiet corridor. Now it's my turn. He didn't wait for me to answer. He turned, pushed open the stairwell door, and disappeared down the steps, leaving me standing outside my lecture hall in the cold autumn morning air. I stood there for a long time, holding my coffee, staring at the closed heavy door. My hands were shaking. My chest was beating with a violent, terrifying flutter. For 3 years, I had been the girl who ran after Ethan Whitman. And as I pushed open the doors to my classroom, I realized the game had officially changed. The boy who never chose me had finally stopped running. The trouble with a boy who spends 3 years ignoring you is that when he finally decides to pay attention, his focus is absolute. Civil engineers do not do anything casually. When Ethan Whitman designed a truss bridge, he calculated axial forces down to the decimal point. When he built a concrete frame, he factored in thermal expansion, wind loads, and soil settlement. And when he decided to chase me, he applied that exact same terrifying, methodical precision. He has been sitting at that table since 8 in the morning, Fiona whispered, leaning over her iced matcha to glare across the 10th floor lounge at Kimmel Center. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon in early November. Outside the high windows, Lower Manhattan was painted in pale silver and gray, the trees in Washington Square Park completely bare against the sky. I kept my eyes fixed on my laptop screen, adjusting the line height on my marketing pitch deck. He has a right to study in the public student lounge, Phi. He doesn't even have his engineering textbooks open, Claire. Fiona hissed softly. He has a legal pad, a black pen, and he has looked at the back of your head 47 times in the last 20 minutes. I'm keeping count. 48, Vivian corrected smoothly from my left, not taking her eyes off her laptop keyboard. He just looked up when the elevator doors opened. I let out a slow, controlled breath, my fingers pausing on my trackpad. I didn't need Fiona or Vivian to keep score. I could feel him. It was a strange, magnetic pull that sat heavy between my shoulder blades, an invisible thread vibrating in the quiet air of the lounge. Ethan was sitting at a high wooden table 40 feet away. He wasn't crowding me. He hadn't tried to sit at our table, he hadn't interrupted our conversation, and he hadn't made a dramatic scene. He was just there. Broad shoulders clad in a simple dark navy sweater, dark hair falling slightly over his forehead, those striking green eyes fixing onto me every time I shifted in my seat. When I picked up my pen, his gaze followed my hand. When I took a sip of my water, his throat worked in a subtle, unconscious swallow. This is weird, Sophie murmured, taking a bite of her blueberry muffin. It's like reverse gravity. For 3 years, you were the moon orbiting his planet. Now he is just sitting over there looking like he is going to fall into the sun. I'm ignoring it, I said firmly, though my cheeks felt faintly warm under my berry lipstick. We have a pitch to present to the client on Tuesday. I am focusing on my career. Right on cue, the glass doors of the lounge swung open. Lucas and Derek walked in, carrying cardboard trays loaded with hot drinks from the daily grind. Lucas marched straight over to our table, setting a giant iced mocha in front of Fiona and a warm cup in front of me. Compliments of the stalker in the corner, Lucas said loudly, pointing a thumb over his shoulder toward Ethan. I looked down at the cup. It was a paper sleeve around a hot cup from the daily grind. Stuck to the side was a bright blue sticky note. On it, written in neat, precise block lettering that I recognized immediately from 3 years of looking over his shoulder at his blueprints, were 4 words. Oat milk. 1 vanilla. Stay warm. Underneath the text, he had drawn a small, terribly rendered vector graphic of a megaphone with the caption, "Good luck on the pitch preparation." My heart gave a heavy, traitorous thud against my ribs. I looked up from the cup, my eyes cutting straight across the crowded lounge. Ethan was watching me. He didn't smile, and he didn't look triumphant. He just sat there, his green eyes steady, serious, and entirely vulnerable, waiting to see what I would do with the note. It was an exact, mirror inversion of 3 years of my life. Do I throw it in the trash for you? Fiona asked, her hand already reaching toward the cup, her dark eyes flashing with protective hostility. Say the word, Claire. I'll drop it in the bin right in front of his face. I looked at the blue note. I looked at the tiny, awkward drawing of the megaphone. I remembered the dozens of notes I had left on his cold brew, the ones he had folded up neatly without a smile, the ones I thought he had tossed away the second my back was turned. I've carried this in my pocket every single day since you gave it to me. No, I said softly, reaching out and sliding the warm cup closer to my keyboard. Don't throw it away. Fiona stared at me, her jaw dropping slightly. Claire. I'm not falling into his arms, Fiona, I said, my voice quiet, steady, and grounded. I met her eyes with total clarity. And I'm not playing games with him either. He bought a coffee. He wrote a note. I am going to drink the coffee because I'm cold, and I'm going to finish my work. Vivian cracked a small, approving smile, nodding once. A pragmatic response. Acceptance of utility without emotional capitulation. You guys speak like textbook manuals, Lucas groaned, sliding into the chair next to Sophie. Look, all I know is that Ethan asked the barista 3 times if the oat milk was fresh because he remembered you said once that they used a bad batch last month. The man is suffering, Claire. He'll survive, I said gently, peeling the blue sticky note off the cup. I didn't throw it in the trash. I slid it flat inside the back cover of my color-coded leather planner, right behind my project timeline. Across the room, I saw Ethan's shoulders visibly drop 2 inches as he watched me keep the note. A faint, almost imperceptible line of tension around his jaw smoothed out. He picked up his own pen, looked down at his blank pad, and began to write. By 6 p.m., the lounge had mostly emptied out. Fiona and Sophie had left for an early dinner, and Vivian had gone to the library to print our final pitch documents. I packed my laptop into my tote bag, wrapped my green wool scarf around my neck, and pulled on my camel coat. As I stood up from the table, Ethan stood up, too. He didn't rush toward me. He slung his dark canvas backpack over one broad shoulder, zipped up his charcoal jacket, and walked at a slow, deliberate pace that matched mine as I headed toward the glass doors and the elevator bank. We stood side by side in the quiet elevator lobby, waiting for the doors to slide open. The space between us felt thick, charged with 3 years of unsaid feelings, rejected coffee, and a freezing rainstorm on Waverly Place. The coffee was good, I said quietly, keeping my eyes on the floor indicator light above the doors. Thank you. Ethan turned his head slowly to look down at me. The harsh overhead lighting caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the dark stubble framing his lips, and the intense, clear green of his eyes. You don't have to thank me, Claire, he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent a familiar ripple down my spine. It's just coffee. It's 6 blocks out of your way, I pointed out softly, glancing up to meet his gaze. From the engineering building. Ethan didn't blink. He took half a step closer, his long frame towering over me, bringing with him the faint, clean scent of cold air and cedarwood. I'd walk 60 blocks, Ethan said. His tone wasn't theatrical or dramatic, it was delivered with the absolute, terrifying sincerity of a mathematical truth. If it meant you took 10 seconds out of your day to look at me. My breath hitched in my throat. The elevator doors chimed and slid open with a soft whoosh. I stepped inside first, turning around to face the front. Ethan followed, stepping in beside me, his broad shoulder just inches from mine in the small metal enclosure. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, I looked at our reflections in the mirrored brass wall. For 3 years, I had stood in elevators with Ethan Whitman, praying he would notice the dress I wore or the way I had curled my hair. I had chattered nervously, filling every second of quiet with noise just to keep his attention attached to me. Now, I stood in complete silence. And Ethan Whitman was looking at my reflection so intently, so fiercely, that it felt like he was trying to memorize every single eyelash framing my brown eyes. The elevator reached the ground floor with a soft ding. The doors slid open to the bustling main lobby of Kimmel Center. Claire, Ethan said softly as I stepped out onto the marble floor. I stopped, turning back to look at him. Yeah? He stood in the doorway of the elevator, holding the door open with one hand, his green eyes searching my face with a quiet, lingering hope. I'm going to be at your presentation on Tuesday, he said. I blinked, surprised. The pitch? Ethan, it's an advanced marketing strategy presentation for a private client in the Shimkin Auditorium. It's mostly business students and faculty. I know, Ethan replied simply. He pulled his hand back, letting the elevator doors slowly slide shut between us, framing his handsome, resolute face until the metal closed completely. "I'll be in the front row." I stood alone in the lobby, my fingers tightening around the strap of my tote bag, my chest thumping with a wild, chaotic rhythm that I couldn't calculate or control. The boy who never chose me was coming to watch me shine. The Shimkin Hall auditorium smelled of floor wax, polished mahogany, and the cold, sharp electric charge of 80 nervous presentation teams. I stood behind the dark wooden podium on the main stage, checking the clicker in my right hand. I was wearing a tailored black blazer over a simple silk cream blouse, a knee-length dark green pencil skirt, and low heels. My shoulder-length dark brown hair fell in glossy, loose waves over my shoulders, and my berry lipstick gave me an edge of polished, unshakable authority. 2 minutes, Team Morgan, Professor Hale called out from his seat in the third row, gesturing toward the digital clock mounted on the wall. "The client representatives from EcoThreads are settled." Fiona nudged my elbow under the podium, her dark eyes glittering with excitement. "You look like a CEO, Claire. Speak loud, look expensive, and don't let the client interrupt your methodology slide." "I won tea," I said, smiling, though my chest tight-roped between adrenaline and focus. Vivian checked her smartwatch. "Audience is full. Business faculty, upperclassmen, and," she paused, her eyes flicking toward the double doors at the back of the hall. A subtle, sharp smirk spread across her face. "A very lost-looking civil engineer." My heart gave a heavy, involuntary thump. I looked up. Ethan was standing at the top of the auditorium stairs. He didn't look like he belonged in a business strategy pitch. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit jacket over a fitted black turtleneck, his dark hair combed back neatly, his jaw freshly shaved. He carried no notebooks, no blueprints, no laptop bag. He walked down the carpeted aisle with a quiet, grounded purpose, stepping past 2 rows of suit-wearing marketing majors, and sat directly in the middle of the front row. Right in my line of sight. His striking green eyes locked onto mine the moment he sat down. He didn't wave, he didn't grin, and he didn't offer a thumbs up. He simply rested his hands on his knees, sat up straight, and gave me a single, slow, reverent nod that said, "I am here. The floor is yours." Professor Hale clapped his hands once. "Whenever you're ready, Claire." I took a deep breath, letting the cool auditorium air expand my lungs. I clicked the slide forward. The massive screen behind me flooded with deep forest green and gold graphics, the EcoThreads rebrand campaign I had spent 4 weeks designing. "Good morning, members of the board and distinguished faculty," I began, my voice clear, rich, and carrying effortlessly across the hall without a single tremor. When we analyze modern consumer friction in the sustainable fashion sector, we find that brand loyalty isn't built on moral appeals. It is built on structural trust. I launched into the pitch. For 25 minutes, the entire room belonged to me. I broke down market segmentation, supply chain transparency graphics, consumer psychology metrics, and projected revenue models. I didn't stumble over a single metric. I didn't look down at my notes. When the client lead raised a sharp question about target demographic retention in urban markets, I answered him instantly, backing my strategy with 2 distinct case studies from the past fiscal quarter. And every time I paused between slides, every time I made a point, my eyes drifted back to the center of the front row. Ethan Whitman didn't break eye contact once. He didn't look at the massive screen behind me. He didn't look at the client leads or Professor Hale. He looked at me. His green eyes burned with an intense, fierce pride, a raw, unspoken awe that made my skin hum under the bright stage lights. 3 years ago, I had sat in the bleachers of his engineering presentations, hanging on his every word while he looked over my head at Olivia. Now, in a packed auditorium of 100 people, Ethan Whitman sat entirely motionless, paralyzed by the sight of a woman who didn't need his permission to shine. And that, I concluded, clicking to the final slide featuring our campaign slogan, is how EcoThreads transitions from a niche sustainable alternative into a core wardrobe staple. Thank you. The auditorium erupted into loud applause. The client lead actually stood up, clapping enthusiastically while nodding at Professor Hale. "Exceptional work, Miss Morgan," Professor Hale announced into his microphone. "Best presentation of the semester." Fiona squealed, grabbing my shoulders in a tight hug behind the podium, while Vivian and Sophie gave me triumphant high fives. I laughed, a bright, genuine sound of relief washing over me as I stepped down off the stage to shake the client's hand. 20 minutes later, the hall had cleared out. The clients had left, the faculty had retreated to their offices, and Vivian and Fiona had gone ahead to the lobby to reserve a table at the celebration dinner. I stood by the podium, packing my flash drives and color-coded presentation cards into my leather tote bag. A pair of polished leather dress shoes appeared at the edge of the stage. I looked up. Ethan was standing at the base of the wooden steps leading to the platform. He had taken off his suit jacket, draped it over his forearm, and rolled his black turtleneck sleeves up to his elbows, revealing those broad, familiar forearms. "You were incredible," Ethan said. His voice was low, slightly husky, and grounded with an absolute, undeniable authority. I set my tote bag down, resting my hands on the podium railing as I looked down at him. "You actually stayed for the whole thing." "I told you I would," Ethan replied, taking one slow step up the wooden stairs. I didn't understand half the consumer behavioral economics formulas on slide 14, but, he paused, stopping on the step just below the platform, bringing his eyes level with mine. "I couldn't take my eyes off you." A faint, warm flush rose to my cheeks, but I maintained my cool, composed smile. "It's a far cry from an inaccurate vector graphic on a scaffolding poster, isn't it?" Ethan winced. A genuine, painful wince that tightened the corners of his green eyes. "Don't," he whispered softly, taking the final step onto the platform, stopping 3 feet away from me. "Don't remind me of how stupid I was." "It wasn't stupid, Ethan," I said gently, picking up my tote bag and slinging it over my shoulder. "It was just who you were. You were a boy who only valued things that fit into your exact blueprints." Ethan stared at me, his jaw clenching tightly. He reached into his pants pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in dark brown leather. He held it out toward me on his broad, open palm. I looked down. It was a custom drafting compass crafted in solid brass with high-precision steel points, engraved along the side with clean, geometric lines. It was a rare, professional-grade tool used by structural architects for manual scale drafting. "What is this?" I asked softly, looking back up into his eyes. "Freshman year," Ethan said, his voice dropping into a quiet, raw confession. "You bought me a vintage drafting compass for my birthday. Do you remember?" My throat tightened. "I remember. You sent me a Starbucks gift card 6 months later for mine." "I was a fool," Ethan said again, stepping an inch closer, holding the brass compass out until it rested inches from my hands. "I bought this yesterday at an antique engineering supply shop on Fulton Street. It's a German-made 1950s Kern compass. Precision calibrated." "Ethan, I'm a marketing major," I said with a small, sad laugh. "I don't use drafting compasses." "I know," Ethan whispered, his green eyes shining with an agonizing, desperate tenderness that made my breath catch in my throat. "It's not for drafting, Claire." He took my hand, his broad, warm, slightly calloused fingers gently wrapping around mine, and placed the heavy brass compass into my palm, closing my fingers over the cold metal. "It's a center point," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly on the words. "In structural engineering, you set the steel point of the compass into the paper first. Everything else, every curve, every arch, every load-bearing circle is drawn around that single, fixed center." He didn't let go of my hand. His thumb rested against the side of my wrist, right over the fast, fluttering pulse that betrayed my composure. "I spent 3 years looking for my center in blueprints, in math, and in people who were never holding me," Ethan whispered, looking straight into my brown eyes with a fierce, unyielding devotion that shook me to my very core. "You are my center point, Claire. You always were. I was just too blind to realize that my whole world was supposed to be drawn around you." I stood on the dimly lit auditorium stage, holding the heavy brass compass in my palm, feeling the steady heat of Ethan Whitman's hand wrapping around mine. For 3 years, I had dreamed of this exact moment. I had dreamed of him looking at me with this exact intensity, offering me his heart on a silver platter. My chest throbbed with a bittersweet, profound ache. I looked down at our joined hands, then back up into his desperate green eyes. "Ethan," I whispered softly. "Don't give it back," Ethan begged instantly, his grip on my hand tightening slightly, his voice thick with panic. "Please, Claire. Keep it. Put it on your desk. Throw it in a drawer. Do whatever you want with it. Just, don't give it back to me." I looked at him for 5 long, quiet seconds. I didn't throw it. I didn't hand it back. I slowly pulled my hand from his grip, slipping the heavy brass compass carefully into the front pocket of my tote bag, right next to my color-coded planner. Ethan let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping as if a massive physical load had just been lifted off his chest. "Thank you," he whispered roughly. "It's a nice compass, Ethan," I said gently, stepping past him toward the stairs. "I'll see you at the group dinner tonight." Ethan turned around on the stage, watching me walk down the aisle toward the double doors of the auditorium. "Claire," he called out softly behind me. I stopped near the exit, turning my head to look back over my shoulder. Ethan stood in the center of the stage under the warm spotlight, tall, handsome, and entirely stripped of his former detachment. "I'm not going to stop," Ethan said, his low baritone echoing softly through the empty hall. "I don't care how long it takes. I don't care if I have to buy you coffee every morning for the rest of my life. I am going to prove to you that you are my only choice." I looked at him, at the boy who had spent 3 years refusing to choose me, now standing in an empty auditorium promising to spend forever trying to earn me back. I offered him a small, quiet smile, pushed open the double doors, and walked out into the bright New York afternoon. The first snowfall of November arrived in quiet, scattered flakes that melted the moment they touched the cold asphalt of Mercer Street. The group had taken over our usual large corner booth at the Silver Dollar Diner. The air was thick with the scent of fried onions, coffee, and buttered toast, the window panes heavily fogged against the freezing afternoon air. And then he looked at the blueprint, Lucas declared, holding up a greasy French fry like a conductor's baton, and told Professor Hale that the bridge's aesthetic value was secondary to its emotional resonance. "Emotional resonance, Claire." Hale nearly choked on his throat lozenge. Fiona snorted into her cherry cola, nearly spraying it across the table. Ethan Whitman talking about emotional resonance? Did someone hit him over the head with a concrete beam? "It was a valid structural consideration for a pedestrian park walkway," Ethan said calmly from across the booth. He was sitting directly opposite me, wearing a simple fitted charcoal sweater over a collared shirt. He looked healthier than he had 3 weeks ago. The dark shadows under his green eyes had softened, though his sharp jawline still carried a relentless, focused intensity whenever he looked at me. He didn't slouch. He didn't look at his phone. His attention was tethered entirely to my side of the table. "Pass the syrup, please," I said smoothly, reaching across the laminate surface. Before Lucas or Fiona could move, Ethan's hand was already there. He picked up the small glass dispenser, wiped a tiny sticky droplet off the spout with a cloth napkin, and placed it gently right next to my plate. "Here," Ethan said softly, his baritone steady and low. "Careful, it's sticky." "Thanks, Ethan," I replied, giving him a brief, polite nod before pouring a neat drizzle over my silver dollar pancakes. I didn't blush. I didn't gush. I didn't spend 10 minutes giggling into my napkin like I would have a year ago. I simply accepted the gesture with the same calm grace I would extend to Derek or Gavin. Across the table, Vivian watched the exchange over the rim of her coffee cup, her sharp eyes calculating the precise shift in dynamics. Ethan didn't pull his hand back immediately. His long fingers rested on the table 3 inches from mine, close enough that I could feel the radiant warmth of his skin against the cool air of the diner. "Are you still going to the Bob's library after this?" Ethan asked gently, his green eyes searching my face. "Yeah," I replied, taking a small bite of pancake. "I have to finish the final narrative deck for the EcoThreads post-launch report." "I can hold a table on the 5th floor for you," Ethan offered instantly. "By the window. The one with the power outlets you like." Fiona paused mid-chew, raising an eyebrow at him. "Whitman, since when do you know which table she likes on the 5th floor?" Ethan didn't take his eyes off me. "Since freshman year," he said plainly, his voice devoid of defensive posture. "I just never bothered to go sit there with her." A heavy, quiet pause settled over the booth. Lucas winced slightly, taking a sudden, intense interest in his burger, while Sophie gave a soft, sympathetic sigh. It was a brutal admission, unvarnished, completely honest, and entirely devoid of self-preservation. That was the most dangerous thing about Ethan's transformation. He wasn't trying to rewrite history or pretend he hadn't been a blind, distant fool for 3 years. He was carrying his past mistakes in the open, using them as a baseline to prove how radically things had changed. "I'm actually studying with Fiona and Vivian today," I said gently, keeping my tone light and clear. "We booked a group study room in Shimkin." Ethan swallowed hard, a tiny, almost imperceptible muscle twitching in his jaw. But he didn't argue. He didn't push. "Okay," Ethan said softly, bowing his head in a quiet acceptance that spoke volumes. Good luck with the deck. By 8 p.m., the light snow had turned into a steady, biting slush that covered the cobblestones of Washington Square West. I stepped out of Shimkin Hall alone, my thick dark green wool coat buttoned up to my chin, my shoulder-length dark brown hair tucked neatly under a soft cream beanie. My tote bag felt heavy against my shoulder, containing my laptop, my color-coded notebooks, and the heavy brass drafting compass Ethan had given me on the auditorium stage 2 weeks ago. I hadn't taken it out of my bag. But I hadn't left it at home either. As I reached the snow-dusted sidewalk, I saw him. Ethan was standing near the stone arch of Washington Square Park, leaning against a lamp post, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dark wool overcoat. Steam rose softly from his mouth with every breath he took. His dark hair was lightly frosted with white flakes of snow. He had been waiting outside in the freezing cold for over an hour. When he saw me step out into the street lamplight, he immediately pushed off the post and walked toward me, his long, heavy strides crunching through the thin layer of slush. "Claire," he called out, his voice husky from the freezing air. I stopped near the edge of the curb, pulling my scarf higher over my mouth. "Ethan. It's 28 degrees out here. Why are you standing in the park?" "Because you were in Shimkin," Ethan said simply, stopping 3 feet in front of me. He pulled one hand from his pocket, holding out a small, steaming paper bag from the bakery down the street. "I got you a warm cranberry orange scone. I remembered you like them when it snows." I looked at the brown paper bag, steam billowing into the icy night air between us. Memory hit me like a sudden, physical wave. Freshman year. The very first snow of our first winter in Manhattan. I had dragged Ethan to the park, freezing in a thin jacket I hadn't properly sized for a East Coast winter, gushing excitedly about the snow while eating a cranberry scone I had bought from a street cart. Ethan had stood beside me back then, hands in his pockets, frowning at the sky, telling me that snow was a logistical nightmare for municipal heating grids. I had tried to feed him a bite of the scone. He had turned his head away, polite and distant, saying, "I don't like sweet things in the morning, Claire." I looked up from the paper bag into his green eyes, so bright, so terribly earnest, and so full of an agonizing, quiet yearning. "You remembered that?" I whispered softly. "I remember everything, Claire," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly against the biting wind. He took a small step closer, shielding me from the cold gust blowing off 4th Street with his broad frame. "I remember that you take 3 sugars in your tea when you're stressed. I remember that you wear berry lipstick when you have a presentation because it makes you feel powerful. I remember that you laugh louder when Lucas tells bad jokes just to make him feel good about himself." He reached out, his bare fingers hovering inches from my face, as if he desperately wanted to tuck a stray strand of dark brown hair back beneath my beanie, but held himself back out of respect for my boundaries. "I remembered it all while it was happening," Ethan whispered, his eyes shining with a raw, agonizing sorrow. I was so terrified of what it meant if I let myself care about you, that I built a cage around my own brain and pretended I wasn't watching you." A tear slipped from the corner of my eye, burning hot against my freezing cheek before catching on my green wool scarf. "Why were you terrified, Ethan?" I asked softly, my voice barely audible over the distant rumble of a snowplow on 5th Avenue. "Why was loving me something you had to protect yourself from?" Ethan looked down at me, his chest heaving under his heavy coat, completely stripped of his logical armor. "Because you were everything I wasn't," Ethan confessed, his voice breaking into a rough, jagged whisper. "You were warm. You were loud. You loved people without asking for a contract or a blueprint first. You walked into a room and made everyone feel like they belonged. And every time I looked at you, I felt like a machine standing next to something real." He closed his eyes for a second, letting out a long, ragged exhale of steam. "I thought if I let you in," Ethan opened his eyes, looking directly into my brown ones with absolute, unyielding devotion, "you would see how cold and broken I was on the inside, and you'd leave anyway. So I chose to keep you at a distance where you couldn't break me." He lowered his hand, gently holding out the warm paper bag once more. "I didn't realize that keeping you at a distance was the exact thing that would destroy me," he whispered. I stood in the falling snow, looking at the boy who had spent 3 years guarding his heart against the girl who had offered him everything. I didn't take the scone. But I didn't walk away either. I reached out, my gloved hand gently closing over his bare, freezing wrist, guiding his hand back toward his coat pocket. "Your hands are freezing, Ethan," I said softly, my voice dripping with a quiet, profound tenderness that made his throat work in a hard swallow. Put your gloves on. Ethan stared down at my gloved hand on his wrist, his green eyes widening slightly with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. Claire, he breathed. I'm going home, Ethan, I said gently, stepping back from him into the soft, swirling white flakes. Walk me to the subway? Ethan Whitman looked at me as if I had just offered him the entire world on a silver platter. The quiet, tragic weight on his shoulders lifted just a fraction, a small, genuine smile finally touching the corners of his lips. Yeah, Ethan whispered, his voice low and fiercely grounded as he stepped beside me, matching my exact stride through the snow. I'll walk you home. We walked side by side down Waverly Place, the same street where he had wept in the freezing rain 3 weeks ago. There was no grand promise. There was no instant fix for 3 years of scars. But as our boots crunched in rhythm through the fresh white snow, the space between us no longer felt like a wall designed to keep me out. It felt like a foundation, finally being built from the ground up. By mid-December, the winter had settled into Manhattan with a crisp, unrelenting grip. Washington Square Park was a portrait of frozen elegance, the grand marble arch dusted in white, the bare branches of the oak trees sparkling with ice under the yellow glow of the street lamps. The smell of roasted nuts, damp wool, and pine branches filled the air along 4th Street as the city readied itself for the holiday break. Final exams were officially over. The crushing weight of senior year deadlines had lifted, leaving behind that strange, heady euphoria that only college students feel on the eve of freedom. Our group had taken over the long, private dining room at Gotham Bar and Grill to celebrate the end of the semester. To passing structural dynamics. Lucas announced loudly, raising his glass of sparkling cider high into the air. And to Derek, who single-handedly prevented me from building a model bridge that would have been classified as a weapon of mass destruction. The entire table laughed, clinking glasses across the white linen tablecloth. To Claire, Fiona chimed in, leaning across the table with a radiant grin, her dark eyes flashing in the warm chandelier light. Who officially signed her full-time offer with the Soho brand agency today. A chorus of cheers erupted around the room. Vivian raised her wine glass in a silent, proud toast, while Sophie squeezed my hand tightly under the table. Congratulations, Claire! Gavin yelled. I smiled, a real, vibrant, effortless smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I was wearing a rich emerald green velvet dress with a soft neckline, my dark brown hair falling in loose, thick curls around my shoulders. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't looking around the room to see if my achievements were being validated by anyone else. I was just happy. Across the table, Ethan sat very still. He was wearing a fitted black suit jacket over a dark gray dress shirt, his hair combed back, looking impossibly sharp. But he wasn't looking at his glass, and he wasn't looking at Lucas. He was looking at me. His green eyes burned with a quiet, fierce pride that felt almost palpable across the table. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. He didn't pull back his polite perimeter. He simply raised his glass to me, his lips curving into a slow, breathtaking smile that was meant for me and me alone. An hour later, as the dinner wrapped up and everyone began pulling on heavy winter coats to head toward the subway, Ethan stepped up beside me near the coat rack. Do you have 20 minutes? He asked softly. His voice was a low, grounded baritone, carrying that familiar, steady weight. He didn't demand. He didn't press. He just asked gently, holding my dark green wool coat open for me. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, adjusting the collar. Where? Just a few blocks, Ethan said, pulling on his own heavy dark overcoat. I want to show you something before everyone leaves for the holidays. I looked into his green eyes, so clear, so steady, so entirely devoid of the cold, distant walls that used to guard them. Okay, I said quietly. We walked in comfortable silence down the snow-dusted sidewalk of Mercer Street. The night was cold and quiet, the crunch of our boots against the snow creating a soft, rhythmic soundtrack in the winter air. Ethan led me toward a quiet, cobblestone side street off Grand Street in Soho, an area framed by historic cast-iron buildings and glowing loft windows. He stopped in front of a wide brick building with massive arched glass windows. The interior was lit by a warm, amber glow, revealing an open studio space filled with drafting tables, scale models, and modern architectural displays. I looked up at the brass lettering mounted above the door, Whitman Bennett Structural Design Studio. I blinked, turning to face him in surprise. Ethan, what is this? Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy steel key ring. He unlocked the heavy glass door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let me enter first. Lucas and I signed the lease yesterday, Ethan said softly, following me into the warm, quiet space. The air inside smelled of fresh paint, polished wood, and laser-cut balsa wood. It's for our independent firm after graduation. We got a small seed grant from the department, and 2 private clients signed on last week. I walked slowly into the center of the room, looking at the exposed brick walls, the high ceilings, and the large wooden drafting table set up by the front windows overlooking the snow-covered street. Ethan, this is incredible, I breathed, turning around to look at him. You built this. You and Lucas actually did it. We did, Ethan said. He walked over to the largest drafting table in the center of the room. It was illuminated by a single, adjustable brass desk lamp. Resting flat on the dark wood surface was a massive, pristine sheet of blue grid paper. Come here, Ethan said gently. I stepped over to the table, leaning forward to look at the drawing. It was an intricately detailed blueprint of the studio space, every wall, every load-bearing column, every desk, and every light fixture drawn in flawless, micro-calibrated scale. In the center of the room, right where the main client reception lounge was marked on the grid, Ethan had drawn a tiny, perfect vector outline of a person. Next to it, written in his neat, dark block lettering, were 3 words. Claire S. Creative Director Suite. My heart stopped. I looked up from the blueprint to Ethan's face. He was standing right beside me, his tall frame leaning slightly over the table, his green eyes fixated on my face with an intensity that made the rest of the world vanish completely. I didn't just design a studio, Claire, Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse, raw, and heavy with emotion. He reached out, his long, broad fingers gently picking up the heavy brass drafting compass he had given me weeks ago, the one I had left on my desk, but which he had carefully placed beside the drawing. I designed a future. Ethan, I breathed, my throat tightening as a warm tear spilled over my lashes. I know I missed 3 years, Ethan said, stepping closer until he was standing inches from me, his chest rising and falling in a rapid, unsteady rhythm. I know I was a blind, arrogant fool who took the best thing in his life for granted. I know I hurt you so deeply that you had to rebuild yourself from scratch just to survive me. He set the brass compass down in the exact center of the blue grid paper, right over the drawing of the studio. You told me that you deserved to be someone's first choice, Ethan continued, his voice cracking violently as he reached out, his bare hand gently cupping the side of my face. His thumb wiped away the warm tear on my cheek, his touch tender, reverent, and trembling. You aren't just my first choice, Claire. You are the only blueprint I have left. I looked into his eyes, the green eyes that had once looked right past me, now filled with an absolute, terrifying devotion that belonged entirely to me. I don't want a life where I'm not chasing you, Ethan whispered, his forehead gently coming to rest against mine in the warm, quiet studio. His breath was warm against my lips, smelling of cedarwood and winter air. I don't want a future where I don't spend every single day earning your heart back. If it takes me 10 years, Claire, if it takes me the rest of my life, I will spend every second proving that you were the only person I was ever meant to choose. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and profound. For 3 years, I had believed that love was a war I had to fight alone. I had believed that if I tried hard enough, stayed close enough, and gave away every piece of my heart, eventually he would see me. I had been wrong about the chasing. Love wasn't about begging someone to see your worth. Love was about standing tall in your own light until the right person realized that living in the dark without you was impossible. I looked up at Ethan Whitman, the boy who had never chosen me, who had finally become the man who refused to let me go. I didn't step back. I didn't run. I slowly reached up, my hand wrapping around his wrist, resting my palm against the warm, steady pulse beating beneath his skin. Then you'd better get started, Ethan, I whispered softly, a small, beautiful smile breaking across my face. You have a lot of lost time to make up for. Ethan let out a long, ragged, shuddering breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief that seemed to echo from the very bottom of his soul. A radiant, stunning smile broke across his face, the first real, unrestrained smile I had ever seen on him. He tightened his arm around my waist, pulling me gently against his chest, holding me close as the snow fell softly outside the wide glass windows of Soho. The boy who never chose me had finally found his center point. And for the first time in 4 long years, we were both finally going the exact same way. In civil engineering, there is a fundamental concept known as yield strength, the exact limit of stress a material can endure before it deforms permanently. Once a structural beam passes its yield point, you can remove the load, but the metal never quite returns to its original shape. Ethan Whitman had pressed me past my yield point on a fire escape in St. Mark's Place. He was holding me now, his broad arm wrapped around my waist, his forehead rested against mine in the quiet, amber-lit warmth of his Soho studio. His chest was heaving with that ragged, shuddering relief, his green eyes dark with an absolute, terrifying devotion. He thought that because I smiled, because I held his wrist, the load was lifted. He thought the equation was solved. He thought 4 years of humiliation could be cured by a blueprint and a confession. I looked into his eyes, feeling the fierce, steady beat of his heart against my ribs. It was warm. God, it was so warm. It was everything 18-year-old Claire Morgan had prayed to whatever gods were listening in her tiny freshman dorm room. Slowly, deliberately, I unlaced my fingers from his wrist. I placed both of my palms against the dark gray dress shirt covering his chest, and I gently, firmly pushed back. Ethan went completely rigid. The radiant relief on his face froze, turning into a sudden, sharp confusion. He didn't fight me, but his arm loosened around my waist as I took 2 steps backward, putting 3 feet of cool, empty air between us on the polished concrete floor. Claire, his voice was barely a whisper, low and rough. I smoothed down the front of my green velvet dress, pulling my shoulders back. My breath was steady, but my chest ached with a deep, heavy resonance. The studio is beautiful, Ethan, I said softly, my voice calm, clear, and grounded. The blueprint is brilliant. And I am genuinely, deeply happy for you and Lucas. Ethan took a step toward me, his hands reaching out instinctively. Claire, I just said. I heard what you said, I interrupted gently, holding up a single hand to stop his momentum. You said you're going to spend the rest of your life earning my heart back. You said you're going to prove that I'm your only choice. I am, Ethan said, his green eyes burning with a sudden, desperate panic. I meant every word. I know you meant it, I replied, looking him dead in the eyes. Which means you need to understand something right now, Ethan, a speech in an empty room doesn't erase 3 years of being invisible. Ethan swallowed hard, the color draining slightly from his face as if I had dealt him a physical blow. I spent 3 years bending myself out of shape for you, I continued, my voice dripping with an honest, heartbreaking clarity that didn't hold a single grain of malice. I changed my schedule. I changed my routes. I bought coffees you didn't ask for, I memorized your study habits, and I humiliated myself over and over again while you looked right through me to see someone else. I destroyed my self-respect to keep you warm. Claire, please, Ethan choked out, his throat working violently. I know I fucked up. You didn't just fuck up, Ethan. You broke my trust in myself, I said softly. You made me feel like loving someone with everything I had was a flaw. It took me months of painful, miserable work to stand on my own 2 feet again. To like myself. To realize that my worth wasn't tied to whether Ethan Whitman looked up from his desk. I looked down at the drafting table at the blue grid paper, at the heavy brass compass sitting in the center, and then back up to his trembling, pale face. I'm not 16 anymore, Ethan. I'm not going to collapse back into your life just because you finally realized what you lost, I said, my tone unshakable. I'm not going to be the girl who waits by her phone hoping for a breadcrumb of your attention. If you want me, you don't get to hand me a blueprint and call it a day. You have to earn the right to touch my life again. Ethan stood in the center of the studio, tall, broad-shouldered, and completely stripped of his logical armor. He really looked at me, and for the first time, he saw the full scale of the damage he had caused. He saw that I wasn't playing a game. I wasn't playing hard to get. I was simply a woman who had learned how to survive without him, and who refused to surrender her peace to a man who had only just learned how to feel. He took a slow, deep breath, his chest rising and falling hard under his black suit jacket. His fists clenched tightly at his sides, then slowly uncurled. He bowed his head once, a gesture of absolute, profound submission. Okay, Ethan whispered. His voice was hoarse, wrecked, but completely steady. He raised his head, looking directly into my eyes with an unyielding, fierce resolve that made my pulse stutter. You're right, Ethan said softly, stepping back to give me space. You're completely right. I don't get to rush this. I don't get to ask you to forget what I did just because I woke up. He walked over to the coat rack, picked up my thick dark green coat, and held it out for me, not touching me, not crowding me, but standing there as a servant to my comfort. I'm not asking you to fall back into my arms, Claire, Ethan said, his low baritone vibrating through the quiet studio. I'm asking for permission to stand in line. I'm asking for the chance to show up, every single day, until you believe me. I looked at him for a long, quiet moment. I slipped my arms into the coat, wrapping it tightly around myself. I didn't reach for his hand. I didn't lean into his shoulder. I'm going home, Ethan, I said quietly. It's late. I'll walk you to the subway, Ethan said instantly. He didn't ask. It wasn't a demand, it was a quiet, non-negotiable fact. I'll stay 5 paces behind you if you want. But I'm walking you. A tiny, bittersweet ache bloomed in my chest. 5 paces, I agreed softly. I turned and walked out the heavy glass door of the studio into the crisp, freezing Soho night. Behind me, I heard the heavy, rhythmic crunch of Ethan Whitman's leather boots against the fresh snow. He didn't try to close the distance. He stayed exactly 5 paces behind, his long shadow stretching beside mine on the white pavement under the street lamps, shielding my back from the icy winter wind. For 3 years, I had walked miles behind him, praying he would turn around. Now, as I walked toward the subway station, I didn't look back once. Because I knew without a shadow of a doubt that the boy behind me was never going to stop following. Spring in New York didn't arrive with gentle warmth, it arrived in damp, turbulent fits. Rain slicked the cobblestones of Soho, washing away the winter salt and replacing the freezing slush with a thick, heavy humidity that clung to the air. My life at the agency had accelerated into a frantic, exhilarating stride. I had spent the last 2 months heading up the visual branding strategy for an up-and-coming sustainable cosmetics brand. I was thriving, exhausted, and profoundly grounded in my own life. Ethan Whitman had kept his promise. He stayed 5 paces back literally and figuratively for weeks. But as winter melted into late spring, those 5 paces had slowly shrunk to 2. Not because he pushed, but because I stopped shrinking away when he stepped close. He showed up. Quietly, relentlessly, without demand. He didn't text me desperate paragraph apologies. Instead, he dropped off my favorite vanilla oat lattes at my desk building when he knew I had 6-hour client presentations. He stood on the sidewalk in the pouring rain to hand me an umbrella because he remembered I always forgot mine on Tuesday mornings. He didn't ask for a reward. He just took the weight where he could, bearing the load without expecting me to sign a contract in return. And the hardest part wasn't holding my boundaries against a cold man. The hardest part was holding them against a man whose gaze burned through me every single time we were in the same room. It was a late Thursday evening, past 8 o'clock, when the skies over Manhattan broke into a sudden, violent torrential downpour. I was at the Whitman Bennett studio in Soho. Lucas had asked me earlier in the week to help review the brand collateral and website layout for their official client launch. Fiona and Vivian were supposed to join us, but Vivian had been stranded uptown, and Fiona was stuck in a stalled subway car on the N train. Lucas had popped out 20 minutes ago to grab takeout from the Thai spot down Bleecker Street, the same place where Ethan had handed me the soy sauce months ago, while refusing to look at Olivia, leaving Ethan and me alone in the high-ceilinged studio. The rain hammered viciously against the grand arched glass windows, blurring the street lamps into smears of warm gold against the dark asphalt. Inside, the space was dim, lit only by 2 low industrial floor lamps and the bright amber glow of the main drafting table lamp. I sat on a high wooden drafting stool, my tablet resting on my knees, my dark brown hair pulled back into a soft, messy low bun. I was wearing a simple, tailored black scoop neck top and dark trousers, sleek, professional, and understated. Ethan was standing at the edge of the drafting table, unrolling a massive set of blueprints for a commercial pier renovation in Brooklyn. He had taken off his suit jacket hours ago. His dark gray dress shirt had the top 2 buttons undone, the sleeves rolled tightly past his elbows, exposing his broad, veined forearms. The ambient warm light caught the sharp angle of his jaw, his dark stubble, and the intense, quiet focus in his green eyes. "The line weights on the hero section look good," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient sound of rain drumming against the glass. "It matches the architectural precision you wanted." Ethan didn't answer right away. He set a heavy brass paperweight onto the corner of the blue grid paper, then slowly turned his head to look at me. He didn't look at my tablet. He looked at my face. His green eyes traced the line of my jaw, my neck, dropping for a split second to the rise and followed my chest before snapping right back up to my brown eyes. The air in the quiet room suddenly felt thick, heavy with an electric, suffocating tension that had been building between us for 5 months. Claire, Ethan said softly. His voice was lower than usual, carrying a rough, gravelly rasp that made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Yeah? I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my pulse had begun to hum a fast, unsteady rhythm in my throat. He slowly pushed himself off the edge of the table and walked toward my stool. His long, heavy strides were unhurried, but deliberate. He stopped bare inches from my knees, towering over me in the dim light. The scent of rain, damp cotton, and his familiar cedarwood cologne washed over me, heavy and intoxicating. You've been ignoring the fact that I'm standing here for 2 hours, Ethan said softly, looking down at me. I tilted my head up, my chin lifted, refusing to back down. I'm working, Ethan. Lucas asked me to check the collateral. Lucas isn't here, Ethan whispered. He reached out. His broad, warm hand didn't grab me. He simply rested his fingers against the polished wood of my drafting stool, right beside my thigh, trapping me gently between his frame and the table behind me. I held my breath. Ethan. I've been good, Claire, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a dark, rough murmur that vibrated straight through my ribs. I stayed 5 paces back. I didn't push. I didn't touch you when I wanted to tear my own skin off just to feel your hand on my arm again. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Are you asking for a medal? A dark, dangerous spark flared in his green eyes. A faint, wicked curve touched his lips, a look I had never seen on the analytical, composed Ethan Whitman of our past. No, Ethan murmured, stepping half an inch closer, his broad chest so close I could feel the heat radiating through his shirt. I'm asking if the penalty phase is over. It's not a penalty phase, Ethan, I breathed, my own voice betraying me, softening into a quiet whisper as he leaned down, bringing his face level with mine. It's trust. You broke it. Then let me build it back, Ethan rasped, his gaze dropping to my lips, lingering there with an intense, hunger-laced focus that made my stomach drop into a terrifying, thrilling freefall. Let me build it back right now. He didn't wait for permission to touch my face, but he moved so slowly I had 10 seconds to pull away. I didn't pull away. His broad, warm hand slowly rose, his calloused fingers gently cupping my jawline, his thumb resting against the curve of my cheekbone. The heat of his palm was scorching against my skin. I let out a soft, shuddering gasp as his touch sent a shockwave straight down my spine. Ethan went completely still, his breath hitching hard in his throat at the sound. God, Claire, he choked out, his voice wrecked with a sudden, overwhelming desperation. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against mine, just like he had on the night he showed me the blueprint, except this time, there was no victory in his posture. There was only hunger. There was only a man who had starved himself for months, hanging on to the edge of his self-control by a microscopic thread. Tell me to stop, Ethan whispered against my skin, his lips brushing the shell of my ear, sending a fierce shiver down my arms. If you don't want this, if you aren't ready, tell me to stop right now, Claire. Because if you don't, I'm going to kiss you. My fingers tightened around the edges of my tablet. Every logical defense I had built over the winter, every boundary, every piece of self-preservation screamed at me to step back, to keep the distance, to make him wait until the final chapter. But as I looked into his dark green eyes, seeing the raw, unvarnished truth of a man who belonged to me completely, the friction finally gave way. Don't stop, I whispered. Ethan let out a harsh, guttural sound from the back of his throat. His hand slid from my jaw to the back of my neck, his long fingers tangling into the loose dark brown hair of my low bun, pulling me up off the stool as his mouth crashed down on mine. The kiss wasn't gentle. It wasn't cautious. It was 5 years of unrequited hope, 5 months of agonizing restraint, and 3 years of buried devotion exploding all at once in the quiet studio. Ethan kissed me with a fierce, possessive intensity that took my breath away instantly. His lips were warm, firm, and hungry, pressing me back against the edge of the high wooden table. I let out a soft, breathless sound against his mouth, my tablet slipping from my fingers and thudding onto the stool behind me. My hands acted on 5 years of instinct. I reached up, my palms sliding over the broad, hard plane of his chest, feeling the wild, frantic thumping of his heart, up over his shoulders, my fingers burying themselves into the dark, soft hair at the nape of his neck. Ethan groaned a deep, low vibration that echoed against my lips, his grip tightening around my waist, lifting me effortlessly until I was sitting on the edge of the drafting table. He stepped directly between my knees, his broad frame crowding me, his heavy thigh pressing against mine as he deepened the kiss, his tongue sliding against mine with a dark, intoxicating rhythm that made my head spin. For 3 years, I had wondered what it would feel like to be kissed by Ethan Whitman. I had imagined it in dorm rooms, on subways, on fire escapes. None of those fantasies compared to the devastating reality of a man who was fighting for his life against my lips. His hand slid down my spine, pressing against the small of my back, pulling my hips flush against his. I felt the hard, rigid length of his body pressed against mine, the sheer physical weight of his surrender. His thumb traced the curve of my waist over my black top, his breath hot, ragged, and chaotic against my mouth. "Claire," Ethan gasped, pulling back a mere fraction of an inch, his lips hovering over mine, his forehead resting against my temple. His green eyes were dark, blown out, trembling with an emotion so intense it looked like pain. "Tell me this is real. Tell me I'm not dreaming this." I sat on the drafting table, my dark brown hair tumbling out of its bun, my cheeks flushed, my berry-tinted lips swollen from his mouth. I reached up, my fingers gently tracing the sharp, dark stubble along his jawline, feeling the hard tremor running through his muscles. "It's real, Ethan," I whispered, my voice thick and breathless. Ethan closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering exhale that pressed his chest hard against mine. He leaned down, pressing a slow, reverent kiss to the side of my neck, right over my pulse point, his lips lingering there until my fingers tightened in his hair. "I'm not going back, Claire," Ethan murmured against my skin, his hands gripping my waist like I was the only fixed anchor in a collapsing world. "I don't care how much time it takes. You're never going to walk behind me again." Before I could answer, the heavy front glass door of the studio unlocked with a loud click. "Hey!" The Thai place was packed, but I got the extra peanut sauce Lucas's voice boom through the studio, followed immediately by the sound of his wet sneakers squeaking against the concrete floor. Lucas stopped dead in his tracks 5 feet from the doorway, holding 2 plastic takeout bags. Ethan didn't jump back like a guilty teenager. He slowly straightened up, keeping one broad hand firmly on my waist, shielding my disheveled frame with his broad back as he turned his head slowly to glare at Lucas over his shoulder. Ethan's green eyes were dark, lethal, and murderous. Lucas looked at Ethan. He looked at me sitting on the drafting table with messy hair and swollen lips. He looked at the blueprint shoved to the side. Lucas's mouth opened. He blinked once. Twice. "I'm going to eat this in the rain," Lucas said solemnly, backing out the front door slowly without breaking eye contact. "Take your time. Take 6 hours." The heavy glass door clicked shut. I let out a breathless, helpless laugh, burying my face against Ethan's chest. Ethan let out a low, rumbling chuckle, his arms tightening around my waist, pulling me close into the warm, quiet dark of the studio as the rain continued to pour over Manhattan. The yield point was long gone. And as Ethan Whitman pressed another soft, lingering kiss to the crown of my head, I realized that some structures don't break when they deform. They just take a brand new, unshakable shape. Summer had taken full ownership of Manhattan by July. The air was heavy, humid, and thick with the scent of hot pavement, rain-washed concrete, and blossoming lime trees along Washington Square North. The city moved in a slower, sun-drenched haze, but inside the Soho studio, time felt as though it was stretching under immense internal tension. That night in the studio had changed the surface of things, but it hadn't magically solved our history. Ethan knew it. I knew it. A kiss didn't delete 3 years of sitting across from someone who wouldn't look at you. If anything, the intense, overwhelming heat of that night had raised the stakes to a terrifying level. Ethan wasn't just trying to win an argument anymore, he was fighting the ghost of the boy he used to be. And watching him do it was painful. "He hasn't slept in his own bed in 3 days, Lucas muttered, leaning over my desk at the agency on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. He tossed a manila folder onto my color-coded desk organizer, his face genuinely drawn with concern. "I'm serious, Claire. He stays at the studio until 3 in the morning working on the Brooklyn Pier blueprints, goes to the 24-hour gym on Fulton Street to shower, and then he's back at his desk by 6. I paused, my trackpad hovering over the brand pitch slides I was refining for my autumn client portfolio. Why is he doing that? The Pier project deadline isn't for 3 weeks. Because he's terrified, Lucas said softly, taking off his baseball cap and running a hand through his hair. He thinks if he slows down, if he isn't constantly building something or proving something to you, he is going to slip back into being that cold, emotionally useless brick wall you hated. My chest tightened with a quiet, sharp ache. I don't hate him, Lucas, I whispered. I know you don't, Lucas said gently. And he knows you don't. But the guy has 4 years of guilt eating him alive from the inside out. He feels like he owes you a lifetime of overcompensation. He told me yesterday that he is taking on the Brooklyn Pier, the Midtown commercial renovation, and the loft redesign all by himself because he wants to make sure Whitman Bennett generates enough profit to buy out your agency's design retainer by next year. I looked at Lucas, my breath catching in my throat. He wants to buy out my retainer? He wants to build you a kingdom, Claire, Lucas sighed, shaking his head. The problem is, he is burning himself to ash just to light the furnace. That evening, I didn't go home after my shift ended at 6. Instead, I walked down Mercer Street toward the Soho studio. The late afternoon sun cast long, amber shadows across the iron building facades, the air stifling and hot. I used the key Ethan had given me 2 months ago, a simple steel key on a leather band that I had kept in my bag, but had never used to enter without knocking. I unlocked the heavy glass door and stepped inside. The studio was quiet, save for the hum of a small desk fan in the corner. Sunlight streamed through the arched front windows, cutting through the floating dust motes. Ethan was sitting at his central drafting table. He was wearing a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans, his dark hair messy, sticking up in wild spikes where he had clearly dragged his hands through it 100 times. His face was pale, dark purple shadows bruised under his striking green eyes, and a dark, unkempt stubble lined his jaw. He was staring at a set of structural load calculations, a black pen clutched so tightly in his long fingers that his knuckles were stark white. He looked completely exhausted. Frayed. Worn down to the absolute steel frame. He was so deeply buried in his own head that he didn't even hear the front door click shut. I walked softly across the concrete floor, stopping 5 feet from the drafting table. Ethan, I said gently. Ethan flinched, his head snapping up instantly. The moment his bloodshot green eyes landed on me, a violent, chaotic flash of panic crossed his features, followed immediately by a raw, desperate effort to fix his posture. He stood up so fast his drafting stool scraped loudly against the floor. Claire, he rasped, his voice rough, cracked, and dry. He cleared his throat quickly, smoothing down his t-shirt, his hands trembling slightly. Hey. I wasn't expecting you. Is something wrong with the collateral? Did Lucas drop off the wrong files? He was frantic. He was trying so hard to be efficient, to be useful, to be the man who had everything under control for me. I didn't answer about the files. I set my handbag down on a nearby chair and walked right up to his drafting table. I reached out and gently closed his thick, heavy engineering manual, sliding his black pen out of his hand. Lucas told me you haven't slept in 3 days, I said softly, looking up into his worn, exhausted face. Ethan went rigid. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply in his throat. He looked away, his eyes cutting toward the window, refusing to meet my gaze. Lucas talks too much, Ethan muttered, his low baritone hoarse with fatigue. I'm fine. I have a lot of structural load checks for the pier foundations. It's a heavy project. Ethan, I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, firm register that commanded the air between us. Look at me. It took him 3 long seconds, but he slowly turned his head to look down at me. Stop, I whispered. Ethan blinked, his green eyes swimming with a sudden, painful confusion. Stop what? Stop trying to build a bridge to a girl who is already standing in the room with you, I said softly, tears prickling at the backs of my eyes as I looked at the sheer ruin of his exhaustion. Ethan's jaw clenched tightly. A deep, agonizing crease formed between his dark brows, his chest heaving under his black t-shirt as if he was struggling to breathe. I have to, Ethan choked out, his voice cracking violently on the words. He stepped around the corner of the table, stopping inches from me, his tall frame trembling with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. I have to, Claire. Don't you understand? No, Ethan, I don't, I said gently. I wasted 4 years. Ethan roared softly, the sound torn from the deepest, darkest corner of his chest. He threw his broad hands out, his composure completely shattering into pieces right in front of me. 4 years, Claire. I watched you walk into rooms, I watched you bring me coffee, I watched you hold out your heart to me on a silver platter and I acted like it was an inconvenience. I made you feel small. I made you feel like you were a second choice. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, dragging them down his face, his breathing shallow, ragged, and frantic. Every time I closed my eyes, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking into a rough, weeping rasp that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. I see you standing on Waverly Place in the rain telling me that you were just a consolation prize. I see you pushing me away in this studio telling me that I broke your trust in yourself. He dropped his hands, looking down at me with an absolute, devastating ruin in his green eyes. Tears spilled over his lashes, cutting clean tracks through the dark stubble on his pale cheeks. I can't undo it, Claire, Ethan sobbed quietly, stepping closer, reaching his hands out toward me, his fingers trembling wildly in the air, terrified to touch me without permission. I can't go back to freshman year and kiss you under the arch in the snow. I can't go back to the fire escape and tell you that you were the only thing keeping my heart beating. All I have is now. All I have is my hands, my work, and every second of my life to try and make up for the damage I caused. He dropped to his knees right there on the concrete floor of the studio. Ethan Whitman, the brilliant, proud, analytical civil engineer who had spent 4 years holding the world at arm's length, dropped to his knees at my feet. He leaned forward, burying his face into the soft fabric of my dark trousers near my knees, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he wept into my clothes. Don't leave me behind, Claire, he choked out, his hands gripping my ankles through my trousers, his grip tight, desperate, and completely unreserved. Please. I don't care about the firm. I don't care about the pier. I don't care about anything if I have to live in a world where you don't believe I love you. I stood in the sunlit studio, listening to the man I had worshipped for 4 years sob at my feet, not because he lost his pride, but because he was drowning in the sheer, crushing weight of his devotion for me. The old anger, the lingering bitterness, the residual fear of being hurt again, it all evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only an overwhelming, profound clarity. He didn't need to earn me anymore. He had already torn himself apart rebuilding the foundation. I slowly dropped to my knees on the cold concrete floor beside him. Ethan looked up instantly, his green eyes wide, bloodshot, and overflowing with tears, his face pale and completely undone. I didn't say a word. I reached out, my palms wrapping around his wet, stubbled cheeks, holding his face in my hands. I leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't like the kiss from weeks ago, it wasn't wild or frantic or hungry. It was soft, deep, and profoundly reverent. I kissed the tears off his cheek, I kissed the corner of his trembling mouth, and then I pressed my lips firmly to his, pouring every drop of forgiveness, warmth, and love I possessed straight into his soul. Ethan let out a loud, shuddering gasp against my lips. His broad arms wrapped around my back like iron bands, pulling me flush against his chest, lifting me slightly off the floor as he kissed me back with an agonizing, beautiful intensity. He held me so tightly I could feel the wild, thunderous beat of his heart against my ribs, merging with mine until there was no distance left between us. Ethan, I whispered against his mouth, my own tears spilling over my cheeks as I threaded my fingers through his dark, messy hair. Listen to me. Ethan pulled back an inch, his breathing hard, his green eyes searching my face with a frantic, desperate focus. I'm listening. I'm right here. The foundation is built, I said softly, my voice dripping with absolute, unshakable truth. You don't have to build any more bridges, Ethan. You don't have to buy out my firm. You don't have to lose sleep to prove yourself to me. Ethan swallowed hard, a trembling breath escaping his lips. Claire. I see you, I whispered, resting my forehead against his, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. I see the man who stood in the rain on Waverly Place. I see the man who saved my sticky note for months. I see the man who sat in the front row of my presentation. I see you, Ethan. And I love you. Ethan went completely still. The words hung in the warm, quiet air of the studio like a holy, sacred light. You love me? Ethan breathed, his voice barely a whisper, as if he was afraid that if he spoke too loudly, the moment would shatter into glass. I love you, Ethan Whitman, I smiled, a bright, tearful, radiant smile breaking across my face as I kissed his jawline. I loved you when you were a cold, arrogant idiot, and I love you now that you're a tired, stubborn idiot who needs to go home and sleep for 12 hours. Ethan let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He buried his face into the side of my neck, his arms tightening around me, holding me against his heart as if he was holding the entire universe in his arms. He kissed my skin over and over my neck, my jaw, my lips with a fierce, reverent joy that made my head spin. I love you, Claire, Ethan whispered into my dark brown hair, his voice low, steady, and finally grounded in absolute peace. God, I love you so much. He didn't ask if we were okay. He didn't ask for a guarantee. Because as the sun began to set over the rooftops of Soho, casting a warm golden light across the blue grid paper on the drafting table, the load-bearing calculations were finally complete. The structural test was over. And the bridge was built to last forever. The thick, stifling heat of late summer finally broke into the crisp, gold-dusted haze of early autumn. Yellow leaves drifted down from the sycamores lining Mercer Street, swirling in the cool gusts that swept off the Hudson River. Outside, the city was shedding its summer inertia, exchanging sticky pavement and humid afternoons for thick wool coats, hot spiced ciders, and the frantic energy of new beginnings. Inside my apartment, the air smelled of cinnamon, toasted bagels, and Ethan's familiar cedarwood cologne. It was a quiet Sunday morning. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of our living room, painting warm rectangles of gold across the hardwood floor. Ethan was lying on his side on my oversized linen couch, one of his long legs hooked over the armrest, fast asleep. His dark hair was messy against my throw pillows, a faint shadow of stubble tracing his sharp jawline, his expression entirely devoid of the tight, anxious tension that had gripped him for almost a year. He was wearing one of his washed-out gray engineering t-shirts and dark sweatpants. On the coffee table beside him rested a half-empty mug of dark roast coffee, no salt, no hazelnut, and a small, worn blue sticky note he had smoothed flat against the wood. I stood at the kitchen island, wrapped in a plush cream cardigan, my dark brown hair pulled back in a loose claw clip, sipping my tea as I watched him sleep. 4 years of waiting. Months of agonizing distance. A tearful confession on the concrete floor of his studio. And now, this, quiet, steady, uncomplicated warmth. Ethan stirred softly, letting out a long, low exhale. His green eyes slowly fluttered open. For a split second, he looked around the sunlit room, his brow furrowing slightly until his gaze found me standing at the island. The instant he saw me, his entire face transformed. A slow, breathtaking smile curved his lips, his eyes softening into that deep, unreserved devotion that still made my pulse flutter. Morning, his voice was low, gravelly, and thick with sleep. Morning, sleepyhead, I smiled, walking over to the couch with my mug. You slept for 10 hours. Because I'm safe, Ethan murmured simply. He didn't hesitate. He reached out, his long, broad arm wrapping around my waist, pulling me down until I was sitting on the edge of the cushions beside him. He shifted, burying his face into the side of my waist, resting his heavy head on my lap with a satisfied, cat-like contentment. I laughed softly, running my fingers through his thick, soft dark hair, feeling the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. Lucas called while you were out, I mentioned gently, scratching softly behind his ear. He said the city building inspector approved the structural permits for the Brooklyn Pier. Ethan let out a low, rumbling hum against my lap, his hand gently resting on my knee, his thumb tracing slow, soothing circles over the fabric of my trousers. I know, Ethan mumbled into my cardigan. He texted me 3 times. I ignored him. I raised an eyebrow, amused. Ethan Whitman ignoring an official municipal permit update? Who are you, and what have you done with my civil engineer? Ethan tilted his head up, resting his chin on my thigh so he could look up into my brown eyes with those intense, brilliant green ones. I'm a man who has his priorities straight now, Ethan said softly, his tone laced with a quiet, unshakable sincerity that made my heart swell. The pier can wait until Monday. Right now, I'm busy. Busy doing what? Looking at you, he replied without a single second of hesitation. A warm flush rose to my cheeks, my smile widening. You're getting dangerously smooth, Whitman. I'm just state testing my facts, Ethan murmured, reaching up to gently touch my cheek, his broad thumb sweeping over my jawline. His touch was warm, reverent, and incredibly tender. And the fact is, I wasted 4 years not looking at you. I have a lot of lost time to make up for. By late afternoon, the autumn wind had picked up, rattling the tall glass panes of the living room. Fiona, Vivian, Lucas, and Sophie had commandeered our apartment for an impromptu Sunday roast. The kitchen was a chaotic disaster of peeling potatoes, open wine bottles, and loud bickering over the playlist. I am telling you, Lucas, if you put on one more indie folk ballad, I am throwing your phone out the window. Fiona yelled over the sound of sizzling garlic, waving a wooden spoon at him. It sets a rustic autumn vibe, fi. Lucas protested, ducking behind Vivian, who was calmly dicing onions without shedding a single tear. It sets a vibe of profound clinical depression, Vivian corrected stoically, not looking up from her cutting board. Put on jazz or face the consequences. I sat on the kitchen counter, my legs swinging, laughing heartily as Sophie tried to save the gravy from burning. Beside me, Ethan was leaning against the counter, wearing a dark navy sweater with his sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He was holding a glass of red wine, leaning his shoulder against my knee, completely integrated into the noise and the chaos. He didn't retreat into his phone. He didn't look uncomfortable. Every few minutes, his hand would casually find mine, his long fingers lacing through mine, giving my hand a quiet, reassuring squeeze, as if constantly anchoring himself to my presence. Lucas looked over at us, his eyes softening into a rare, genuine expression of joy. Look at them, Lucas said, pointing a potato peeler at Ethan and me. Disgusting. Absolutely nauseating. Remember when this guy used to talk about structural load distributions for 3 hours just to avoid acknowledging that Claire wore a nice dress? The whole room burst into laughter. Ethan didn't wince. He didn't get defensive. He simply looked up at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he brought my hand up to his lips, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss to the back of my knuckles in full view of everyone. I was an idiot, Ethan said plainly, looking Lucas dead in the eye with a small, confident smirk. We've established this. Move on to a new case study, Lucas. Oh, he is self-aware now. Fiona cheered, raising her glass of red wine in a dramatic toast. To Ethan Whitman, the only man in New York who needed 3 years, for blueprints, and a rainstorm on Waverly Place to realize he was in love with his best friend. To Ethan and Claire, Sophie beamed warmly. To the center point, Vivian added smoothly, raising her glass. We all clinked our glasses together, the sound ringing bright and clear through the warm, golden apartment. Later that evening, after everyone had eaten, argued, and finally cleared out into the crisp Sunday night air, Ethan and I stood on the small fire escape balcony outside my bedroom window. The city lights twinkled in the clear autumn darkness, Manhattan humming with its distant, beautiful roar below us. The wind was cool, biting slightly against our skin, but Ethan stood behind me, his broad arms wrapped tightly around my waist, his chest pressed against my back, keeping me completely warm inside his heavy coat. My hands rested over his on my stomach, my head leaning back against his shoulder. Do you remember this place? I whispered softly into the cool air, looking down at the black iron railings. Ethan went quiet for a beat. He rested his chin on the top of my head, his arms tightening slightly around me. Street Marks Place, Ethan murmured, his voice low and raspy against my ear. You were wearing a dark green coat. You handed me a cold brew, and I told you that you were wasting your time. I cried for 2 days after that, I confessed softly, not with anger, but with the gentle reflection of a scar that had finally healed cleanly. Ethan let out a slow, heavy breath, his lips pressing a long, reverent kiss into my hair. I know, Ethan whispered. And every time I think about it, I want to go back in time and beat the hell out of myself. I turned around inside his embrace, facing him in the dim light of the city. I reached up, wrapping my arms around his neck, my brown eyes holding his green ones. Don't, I said gently. If you hadn't been an idiot, I wouldn't have learned how to stand on my own 2 feet. And if I hadn't walked away, you wouldn't have learned how to chase me. Ethan looked down at me, his green eyes glowing with an intense, fierce devotion that made my heart hammer against my ribs. He leaned down, his lips brushing softly against mine, a kiss that tasted of warm wine, autumn air, and a future built to withstand every storm. I'm never going to stop chasing you, Claire, Ethan whispered against my mouth, his hands holding my waist like I was the most precious thing in the entire world. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. I smiled into the kiss, wrapping my arms tighter around his neck, letting the cool city wind blow around us as we stood together on the iron balcony, no longer 2 separate points under tension, but one unbreakable structure, built to last a lifetime. The first autumn frost had settled over Washington Square Park, turning the morning grass into a lattice of shimmering glass. Crisp, fallen sycamore leaves swept across the wide concrete paths, and the sharp, clean scent of cold air and roasted espresso drifted down 4th Street. For years after freshman orientation, the Shimkin Hall Grand Auditorium looked unchanged, the polished mahogany podium, the dark velvet seats, the heavy brass door handles, except this time, we weren't students nervously adjusting our blazers in the 3rd row. We were the keynote speakers. 3 minutes, Ms. Morgan, Professor Hale called out, stepping out of the faculty wings with a proud, fond smile. His hair had thinned slightly over the years, but his sharp blue eyes were as keen as ever. The dean has already seated the incoming senior business and civil engineering cohorts. I stood behind the side stage curtains, checking the drape of my forest green tailored blazer over a cream silk blouse. My shoulder-length dark brown hair fell in soft, glossy waves, and my berry lipstick gave me that familiar, unshakable aura of authority. "You look stunning," a low, deep baritone murmured behind me. I turned. Ethan was standing 2 steps away, looking impossibly handsome in a dark charcoal suit, a black turtleneck, and a silver watch on his wrist. The dark shadows that had once bruised his eyes were completely gone, replaced by a steady, radiant calm. He didn't hesitate. He stepped close, his broad hands gently adjusting the collar of my blazer before his fingers brushed against the side of my neck, his touch warm, familiar, and electrifying. "Ethan, Professor Hale is watching," I whispered with a small, playful smirk, though I leaned into his palm anyway. "Let him watch," Ethan said smoothly, his green eyes burning with an open, fierce pride. "I'm just inspecting the structural integrity of my partner." I laughed softly, reaching up to smooth down his lapel. "Our joint keynote presentation is on collaborative design ethics, Whitman. Try not to lecture them exclusively on load-bearing capacities." Ethan curved a faint, wicked smile, the kind of confident, relaxed smile he only ever gave to me. "I make no promises." The auditorium doors opened, and 100 upperclassmen flooded down the carpeted aisles. Among the crowd in the front row, Lucas and Fiona waved enthusiastically, while Vivian gave us a subtle, approving nod from beside Sophie and Gavin. They had all come to watch us give the annual Alumni Innovation Address. "Whenever you're ready, Claire," Hale called out. I took a deep breath, feeling the steady heat of Ethan's hand briefly squeeze mine, a silent, powerful anchor before we stepped out onto the main stage under the bright spotlights together. For 45 minutes, the stage belonged to us. We didn't just present metrics or architectural renders of our recent Soho Loft project and the completed Brooklyn Pier. We spoke about the intersection of creative vision and structural reality, about how a campaign fails without a solid foundation, and how a structure remains soulless without a narrative to give it purpose. When a student in the 4th row raised his hand to ask how we managed conflict between marketing and engineering when a project was under immense stress, I paused, turning my head to look at Ethan. Ethan stepped up to his microphone, his green eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the entire crowded hall fade into the background. "You don't force a material past its yield strength," Ethan said, his baritone carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "And you don't build walls to protect yourself from the load. You learn to listen to the friction, you adjust the design, and above all," he paused, his voice dropping into a quiet, raw sincerity that sent a shiver down my spine. "You make sure you are built around a center point that doesn't move." A quiet murmur ran through the auditorium. In the front row, Fiona wiped a dramatic tear from her eye while Lucas grinned like an idiot. I smiled, turning back to the student. "Which is just a long civil engineering way of saying, you respect the foundation." The room erupted into loud, ringing applause. Later that evening, after the faculty reception had wrapped up and the campus had quieted under the dark, starlit sky, Ethan and I walked hand in hand past the marble arch of Washington Square Park. The cool night wind blew through the trees, carrying the faint, distant hum of Manhattan nightlife. Ethan led me down Waverly Place, the same cobblestone street where he had stood crying in the rain a year ago, the same street where I had walked 5 paces ahead of him in the snow. Except tonight, we walked side by side, our fingers tightly laced together, his broad shoulder brushing against mine with every stride. He stopped directly under a historic wrought iron street lamp, the warm amber light cascading over us, casting our joined shadows long and crisp against the pavement. "Claire," Ethan said softly, pulling me around to face him. "Yeah?" I asked, looking up into his dark green eyes. Ethan reached into his coat pocket. He didn't pull out a blue sticky note, a coffee cup, or a blueprint. He pulled out a small, velvet-lined wooden box. My heart gave a massive, violent thump against my ribs, my breath catching in my throat. Ethan didn't drop to his knees in a theatrical performance for the city. Instead, he stood tall, grounded, and completely vulnerable, holding the open box out between us. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a breathtaking ring of sparkling, conflict-free diamonds set in a precision-milled platinum band, flanked by 2 tiny, geometric emeralds. "I didn't buy this from a jewelry chain," Ethan said, his voice hoarse, thick with a deep, trembling emotion that made his hands shake slightly. "I designed the setting myself in the studio." The structural geometry, the band calibration, everything was calculated down to the millimeter. A hot tear spilled over my lashes, slipping down my flushed cheek in the cool air. "Ethan," I whispered. "I spent 4 years thinking I could calculate my life without you, Claire," Ethan choked out, his green eyes shining with an absolute, terrifying devotion as he looked down at me. "I was wrong. You were never just a phase, or a friend, or a choice among choices. You were the foundation I was missing all along." He reached out with his free hand, his broad, warm fingers gently wiping the tear from my cheek. "I don't want a future that isn't built around you," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking violently with raw love. "Will you marry me, Claire? Will you build the rest of this life with me?" I looked at the boy who had once looked right past me. I looked at the man who had spent a year proving that I was his only center point. I didn't hesitate for a single second. "Yes," I sobbed softly, a radiant, breathless smile breaking across my face. "Yes, Ethan. Of course I will." Ethan let out a loud, shuddering breath of pure, unadulterated joy. He slid the platinum ring onto my finger, a flawless, perfect fit, before wrapping his broad arms around my waist and lifting me right off my feet. I threw my arms around his neck, laughing tearfully as he spun me around under the warm street lamplight of Waverly Place. When he set me down, his mouth crashed onto mine in a deep, passionate, and reverent kiss that tasted of tears, cold winter air, and absolute forever. The load was born. The structure was complete. And as the snow began to fall softly over New York City, 2 points under tension finally became one unbreakable home. 3 years later. The spring sun warmed the outdoor patio of our brownstone in Brooklyn. The garden was in full bloom, vibrant green hydrangeas, blooming jasmine, and dark red roses climbing the brick walls. The sound of clinking coffee mugs and warm laughter echoed through the open glass patio doors. Inside, the living room was filled with our family. Fiona was sitting on the rug, attempting to teach our 2-year-old daughter, Lily, how to hold a drawing marker, while Lucas sat nearby on the couch showing a set of miniature wooden building blocks to Sophia's newborn son. Vivian sat at the dining table with Gavin, reviewing the quarterly expansion metrics for Whitman Morgan Design Group. We had merged our firms 2 years ago. It was the most successful cross-disciplinary strategy agency in the city. I walked out onto the patio wearing a comfortable cream linen dress, my dark brown hair swept up in a loose clip. In my hand, I carried a tray of iced teas and fresh pastries. Ethan was standing by the garden railing, looking out over the quiet, tree-lined street. He was wearing a simple dark gray t-shirt and jeans, his dark hair neatly cut, looking broad, handsome, and profoundly happy. On his left hand, the platinum wedding band caught the golden afternoon light. As I set the tray down on the patio table, Ethan turned around. The moment his green eyes landed on me, that same fierce, devoted light flared in his gaze, the exact same look he had given me in the Shimpton Hall Auditorium, in the Soho studio, and under the street lamp on Waverly Place. He walked over, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind, pulling me flush against his chest as he rested his chin on my shoulder. "She's trying to draw a vector graphic," Ethan murmured into my ear, gesturing toward the living room where Lily was enthusiastically scribbling green lines on a pad of grid paper with Fiona. I laughed, leaning back against his warm, solid frame. "She gets that from her father." "No," Ethan whispered, pressing a slow, sweet kiss to the side of my neck, making me shiver. "She gets the creative genius from her mother. I'm just the guy who makes sure the desk doesn't collapse." I turned inside his embrace, wrapping my arms around his neck, my brown eyes looking up into his green ones. "You're a lot more than that, Ethan Whitman," I smiled gently. Ethan smiled a bright, beautiful, unrestrained smile and reached into his back pocket, pulling out a small, worn piece of paper. I blinked, looking at it. It was a blue sticky note. The paper was faded around the edges, but written in neat, dark block lettering was a simple list from 7 years ago. Buy coffee, no salt. Review vector graphics. Don't look at Claire. Crossed out in thick, bold black ink at the bottom was line 3, and underneath it, written in Ethan's clear, steady handwriting, were 4 new words. Look at Claire forever. Tears of pure, overwhelming happiness prickled my eyes as I looked up at him. "You kept this?" I whispered. "I keep everything that belongs to my foundation," Ethan said softly, his voice dripping with an absolute, unshakable devotion as he leaned down, pressing his lips gently to mine. I kissed him back deeply, peacefully, and with the full certainty of a woman who was loved beyond measure. No more chasing. No more waiting. Just a load-bearing love, built to stand forever.